close your eyes and transport yourself to a time when life moved at a completely different rhythm. Instant connectivity of your smartphone, the hum of air conditioning, the smooth glide of an airplane. Imagine instead, on your face, the rough wool scratching against your skin, the constant, gnawing ache in your bones. This isn't a curated Instagram post. This is the raw, unvarnished truth of travel in the age of the Crusades. A tourist seeking exotic selfies, you are a pilgrim, a soldier, soul embarking on a journey that would redefine the very concept of hardship. Tales of chivalrous knights and glorious battles, so prevalent in our modern imagination. Worn leather of your boots, they are a comforting veneer over a reality that was, quite frankly, terrifying. Changes as you consider the sheer, unadulterated distance. You are not crossing continents in a matter of hours that were wild, untamed, and often actively hostile. Let us consider the First Crusade, undertaking that began in 1095. Tice's impassioned plea at the Council of Clermont ignited a fervor that would send tens of thousands westward, yourself among them. You are leaving behind familiar villages, the scent of wood smoke and baking bread, the comforting creak of your own bed. Ahead lies a void, a vast unknown populated by rumors and fears. Your journey begins on foot, astride a wary mule. The road, if you can even call it that, is often little more than a rutted track by the passage of countless feet and hooves, or baked into a dusty, cracked expanse under a relentless sun, carries the weight of the world. In the early spring of 1096, as the peasant crusaders, the Lauve Paupers Cruces Ignati, fated march, the air was crisp and carried the scent of damp earth and budding leaves. But as summer wore on, replaced by the acrid stench of unwashed bodies, festering wounds, and the ever-present metallic tang of fear, clad in rough-spun woolen tunics, perhaps layered with a leather jerkin for some semblance of protection against the elements and the occasional wild animal. Your footwear is simple leather boots, likely poorly made and quickly worn through. There are no Gore-Tex linings here, no breathable fabrics. Exposed to the elements and the rough terrain are your primary mode of conveyance. Blisters are not a minor inconvenience, precursor to infection, a gateway to agony. The taste in your mouth is a constant companion, dry, dusty, metallic from desperation or the meager rations you manage to scrounge. Let us imagine a specific moment, perhaps near Antioch, become a crucible for the Crusaders. It is the late autumn of 1097. The vibrant greens of summer have faded to the muted browns and greys of decay. The air is cold, biting. You huddle around a meagre fire, the smoke stinging your eyes, the crackling flames offering a temporary reprieve from the gnawing chill that seeps into your very bones. Scarce. Perhaps you have managed to secure a handful of dried peas, a sliver of hard cheese, or a piece of tough, salted meat. Unsatisfying, a far cry from the hearty stews you might have known at home. The soundscape is a symphony of misery, coughs of the sick, the low moans of the dying, the desperate prayers whispered into the darkness. Wool against your skin is a constant reminder of your discomfort. Consider the conversations you might hear. Brother Thomas, you whisper, your voice hoarse. Have you seen the state of Guillaume's leg? It festers something awful. Thomas, his face gaunt and streaked with grime, shakes his head, his eyes hollow. I have. Well, they do what they can, but the humours are out of balance, they say. I fear for him. He shivers, pulling his threadbare cloak tighter. This land, it drains the very life from a man. And the food. You continue, steady. I saw a man yesterday, gnawing on a boiled leather strap. said it was better than the rats. A gruff voice from the other side of the fire interjects. Rats are plentiful enough, the stomach for them. I learned that lesson in near Nikaya. Never thought I'd be grateful for the taste of vermin. This is Robert, a seasoned knight whose armor, once gleaming, is now dented and tarnished. His hands, sand-scarred, grip a wooden cup filled with watered down wine. Holy Quest is more like a pilgrimage through hell. Fumai, I discovered in my research that disease was a far greater killer than any blade. Typhus, plague, these were the invisible armies that decimated the Crusader ranks. The lack of sanitation was astounding, simply discarded, contaminating water sources and breeding grounds for disease. Imagine the smell. You are breathing it in constantly. The stench of unwashed bodies, of rotting food, of animal excrement, it permeates everything. The architecture you encounter when you finally reach a settlement, a stark contrast to the squalor of your journey. Yet, even within these stone walls, life is harsh. The castles are drafty, smoky from open fires, the food limited and monotonous. But at least there are walls. For those outside, of raiding parties is a constant anxiety. The ground beneath your feet, dusty earth of the road, or the cold stone of a foreign city offers little comfort. You might witness a scene like this. Crusaders, their faces etched with exhaustion and despair, huddled around a sputtering fire outside the walls of a besieged city. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and the distant, metallic tang of blood. The only sounds are the low murmur of prayers, occasional cough, and the distant cries of sentries. Their clothing is a patchwork of worn fabrics, stained and torn. Got their eyes sunken. They are a living testament to the brutal reality of their undertaking. The touch of the cold seeps through your thin cloak as you try to find a moment of rest. The taste of dust is always on your tongue. Ache from clutching your meager possessions. You close your eyes, and even in sleep, the images of the day, sounds of suffering, replay themselves. This is not the adventure you were promised. This is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Yes, a stark reminder of the immense suffering endured by those who dared to travel in the age of the Crusades. Changes as we prepare to delve deeper into the specific challenges faced by these early travelers. Logistical nightmare of sustaining such a vast, mobile population across hostile territories is a story in itself. Will reveal even more about why traveling in this era was an ordeal few would willingly repeat. Primary sources reveal details that will change how you see this entire period. Forget the gleaming armor, the triumphant banners, quests of ballad and legend. Your journey begins not with a fanfare, but with a gnawing dread. You wake up not to the crisp morning air of a spring dawn, stench of 1,000 unwashed bodies crammed into a makeshift encampment. The ground beneath you is not soft grass, muddy mire, still damp from a night of relentless cold rain. The air, thick and heavy, carries the acrid bite of wood smoke, stale urine, and the unmistakable, horrifying sweetness of decay. The world around you evolves. For night, setting out, his steed caparisoned, and his squire at his heels, shatters like fragile glass. Thousands, a nameless face in a vast, roiling sea of humanity. Your steed might be a bony, flea-bitten nag. Perhaps you are walking, your feet already blistered and bleeding through thin leather soles. Gleaming armor is more likely a patchwork of dented iron and hardened leather, ill-fitting and chafing your skin raw. Your clothing, rough-spun wool, clings damply to your body, offering little protection against the biting wind that whips across the desolate landscape. seeping into your bones, a constant, unwelcome companion. The sheer scale of the undertaking is overwhelming. Day traffic jam, 1,000 times worse, stretching for miles across uneven terrain. This is your reality. The roads, call them that, are little more than rotted tracks, churned into treacherous quagmires by the passage of countless feet and crude carts. Every step is a battle against the mud, which sucks at your boots with an insistent, greedy pull, threatening to pull them off your feet and swallow them whole. The constant jostling of the crowd, the press of bodies against yours, is suffocating. You can feel the clammy sweat of strangers on your skin, hear their ragged breaths, their whispered curses, hacking coughs. There is no personal space, no privacy, only the relentless, suffocating proximity of fellow sufferers. The food is barely edible. Imagine stale, hard bread, often infested with weevils, gnawed on until your teeth ache. Greasy broth made from boiled scraps of meat. If you are fortunate, more often it's dried peas or beans, mush that offers little sustenance and less comfort. The taste is bland, monotonous, tinged with the metallic tang of rust from the cooking pots or the earthy flavor of dirt that has inevitably found its way in. You can feel the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, a constant ache that fuels your desperation. The water, ponds or muddy streams, is often brackish and teeming with unseen life for dysentery and other debilitating diseases. You force it down, your throat dry and parched, gamble with every swallow. The world around you evolves. Jovial camaraderie you might have imagined is replaced by suspicion and fear. Interaction is fraught with the possibility of betrayal or violence. Resources are scarce, and the desperation for food, water, place to rest can turn neighbor against neighbor. You see men arguing fiercely over a handful of dried rations, gaunt and their eyes hollow with hunger. You witness the swift punishment meted out for minor infractions, a stolen loaf of bread, a misplaced tool. There's a palpable tension in the air, undercurrent of anxiety. You overhear a hushed conversation between two men huddled around a sputtering fire. One, a burly peasant named Thomas, his face etched with exhaustion, coughs weakly. Another one gone. He rasps, his voice rough. Fever took him in the night, just like that. He gestures vaguely towards the dark, silent tents. His companion, former soldier named Roland, nods grimly, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his worn dagger. Roland mutters, his eyes scanning the shadows. It's as deadly as any Saracen blade. Half our company to it before we even reached Constantinople on the First Crusade back in 96. He spits into the mud. They say it's better organized. The world around you evolves. The nights are the worst. Little respite. The cold seeps into your bones, and the ground offers no comfort. The sounds of the camp are a symphony of misery, the whimpering of the sick, the coughs that rack emaciated bodies, shuffling of feet, the occasional, terrifying scream from someone plagued by nightmares or delirium. Weave of your blanket, thin and insufficient, scratch against your skin. The darkness is absolute, flickering, unreliable glow of scattered campfires, casting long, distorted shadows that play tricks on your eyes. The damp earth, the decaying leaves, and the ever-present, sickly, sweet odor of sickness and death. In the archives of the Benedictine Abbey of Saint Germain des Prés, a series of letters penned by a monk named Brother Anselm, his journey on the Third Crusade. He writes of the sheer, grinding tedium, punctuated by moments of abject terror, describes the dysentery that swept through their ranks like wildfire, turning the very act of living into an agony. the stench of the latrines, he writes, his quill scratching across the parchment, is a torment far greater than any Saracen's scimitar. We are reduced to eating roots and whatever vermin we can catch, our bodies with pain, our spirits crushed by the endless, agonizing march. He laments the loss of his companions, but to the slow, insidious creep of disease and starvation, we are like ants. He notes, marching to our own destruction, our faith a fragile shield against the overwhelming reality of our suffering. The world around you evolves. You see the casual cruelty that becomes commonplace. A man collapses from exhaustion, his cartload of supplies spilling into the mud. Instead of aid, he is met with curses and kicks from those struggling to pass. His meager possessions are quickly plundered by those more desperate than he. Witness the grim efficiency with which the dead are dealt with, unceremoniously dragged to a mass grave. So much refuse. There is no time for mourning, no space for sentiment. Survival is the only imperative. Find yourself near a small cluster of tents where a group of knights are attempting to organize. Sir Reginald, fine surcoat is now stained and torn, is arguing with a stout merchant, his face flushed with anger. Provisions merchant. Reginald bellows, his voice hoarse. These men are starving. Another league on empty bellies. The merchant, a portly man named Bartholomew, wipes his sweaty brow with a linen cloth. Pray tell, am I to conjure more grain, Sir Reginald? The last shipment was ravaged by brigands near Antioch. What little we do. He gestures to a few meager sacks piled haphazardly. The roads are death traps. Costs us men and supplies. You speak of marching, I speak of survival. The world around you evolves. The destination, the glittering prize of Jerusalem, seems impossibly distant. A mirage shimmering on the horizon of your despair has become the enemy, a relentless gauntlet of physical and mental torment. Exhaustion settling deep into your muscles, a bone weary fatigue that no amount of rest can alleviate. Your mind, pious fervor, is now a dull ache, focused only on the next step, the next meager meal, the next sunrise. The romantic notions of chivalry and glory have been stripped away, leaving only the raw, brutal reality of a pilgrimage that is slowly killing you. You begin to understand that the greatest enemy on this crusade is not the Saracen act of traveling itself, a brutal testament to the immense, often fatal, cost of faith and psychological toll of such arduous journeys is a chilling reminder of how fragile life was. It could be extinguished by the simple yet profound act of moving from one place to another. This arduous reality from the romanticized tales sets the stage for the next harrowing chapter of your experience. Tonight, experience history not from textbooks, but from the inside. Peel back the polished veneer of chivalry and faith and stare into the grimy, soaked reality of travel during the Crusades. Forget the romantic notions of valiant knights on noble quests. We will uncover is a visceral testament to human endurance, a testament to suffering, and a grim promise I intend to keep. Precisely why traveling sucked in this era, to the point of sheer horror. Understand that the romance of the Crusades is a modern invention, a convenient narrative that glosses over the sheer trade every soul who dared to venture east. We've already glimpsed the mundane rhythms of life, the stark contrast to our own instantaneous connections. We've also touched upon the primary sources, parchments and faded inks that whisper truths far more potent than any epic poem. Now, we delve deeper of that experience. Imagine, if you will, the year is 1190. You are not a knight in shining armor, simple artisan, a humble farmer conscripted by your lord. Desperate souls seeking salvation, or perhaps just a chance to escape a life of crushing poverty. Outskirts of a bustling, yet undeniably chaotic, port town. Let's say it's Marseille, embarkation point for many heading towards the Holy Land. The air is thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting fish, tang of animal dung. Seagulls cry overhead, calls a harsh counterpoint to the cacophony of human voices, shouts of merchants hawking their wares, the guttural curses of carters struggling with overloaded wagons, the mournful bleating of sheep destined for the ships. Your clothing, tunic and breeches, feels rough against your skin, perpetually damp from the sea mist. Worn leather pouch containing your meager possessions, a loaf of hard bread, a small water skin, and perhaps a simple prayer book. Pale disk in the hazy sky offers little warmth. You can feel the damp seeping into your bones, a familiar, unwelcome sensation. You've spent weeks, perhaps months, gathering supplies and making your way to this point. The journey from your village deep in the French countryside was an ordeal in itself. Roads, if you can call them that, were little more than rutted tracks, passable mud by the passage of countless feet, carts and animals. You walked day after day under the stars or in crowded flea-ridden inns where the straw on the floor was often more alive than the patrons. Each step was a calculated risk, the threat of bandits lurking in the dense forests, the ever-present danger of disease, gnawing hunger that became a constant companion. You see a group of other pilgrims gathered near the docks, etched with a mixture of apprehension and forced optimism. Among them is a grizzled man with a thick beard, armor-dented and stained. This is Sir Caelan, a veteran of the Second Crusade, his eyes holding a wariness that speaks volumes. Man, barely more than a boy, clutching a crude wooden cross. "Mark my words, lad," Sir Caelan rasps, his voice hoarse. "These ships are no palaces. They are floating coffins, meant to cram as many souls as possible. Sardines with barely enough room to breathe, let alone move." The young man, Thomas, swallows hard. "The Pope's blessing, Sir Knight. Surely that protects us." Sir Cullen snorts, a dry, humourless sound. "The Pope's blessing doesn't stop the rats from gnawing at your flesh in the darkness, boy. It doesn't stop the flux from taking hold, from burning you from the inside out. Faith is a shield, it's a flimsy one against the storm that awaits." You begin to understand the sheer logistical nightmare of these expeditions. Modern travel, where schedules are meticulously planned and infrastructure is robust, relied on a fragile network of limited resources and goodwill. Ships were often commandeered, compensated with promises of heavenly reward rather than immediate coin. The vessels themselves were typically merchant cogs or galleys designed for cargo, not for transporting thousands of people across vast, treacherous seas. Imagine being crammed into the hold of a ship, the air thick with the smell of bilge water, unwashed bodies, present fear of the unknown. The food, when it was available, was a grim affair. Hardtack, biscuits, they could break teeth, supplemented with salted meat that was often rancid. Fresh water was a precious commodity, carefully. Water barrels, often made of porous wood, would leak and the water within would quickly become stagnant. Scene life, the constant rocking of the ship, combined with the foul food and air, inevitably led to seasickness, taking condition that left travellers weak and vulnerable. I discovered in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France a detailed account from a pilgrim named Fulcher of Chartres. Stench of the sea, the stench of the soldiers, and the stench of the sick. He wasn't exaggerating. Itself could take months. Imagine weeks upon weeks of nothing, but the endless expanse of the sea, the relentless sun beating down, fury of a storm that could capsize the fragile vessel in an instant. There was no entertainment, no comfort, the crushing monotony, and the ever-present threat of death. You'd see fellow travelers succumbing to dysentery, racked with pain, their last breaths a desperate plea for water. The cries of the dying would mingle with the groaning of the ship and the roar of the waves. You watch as a group of sailors, men with weathered faces and calloused hands, begin to load livestock onto one of the ships, the animals penned tightly, miasma of the port. Their fear is palpable, they're lowing a mournful soundtrack to this grim spectacle. You notice a woman, by a veil, clutching a small child. Her shoulders tremble, and you realize the sheer terror she must be experiencing. Her fate, and that of her child, is now entirely in the hands of the sea and the capricious whims of those in command. Understand that the commitment to travel during the Crusades was not a choice made lightly, nor was it a journey undertaken with ease. It was a profound act of faith, yes, but also an act of immense physical and mental fortitude. Of moving from one place to another was an undertaking fraught with peril, a testament to a world far removed from our own conveniences. The promise I made was to show you the grim reality, and as we stand here, precipice of this journey, that reality is beginning to dawn with terrifying clarity. The true horror, you see, wasn't just the battles to come, but the agonizing, soul-crushing journey to get there. And that, my friends, is only the beginning of our descent. Sometimes I wonder what it would feel like to truly experience life in this distant time, dust-laden air of a medieval marketplace, to feel the rough wool of a tunic against your skin, guttural prayers of 1,000 men echoing in the night. It's a yearning that draws me, a historian of archives, to the brittle whisper of parchment. You see, the previous whispers painted pictures of a different rhythm of life, of the stark realities revealed by primary sources, and of my own journey into the past were just the prelude. They were the gentle stirring of the embers. Now, as we settle deeper into this narrative, into the very marrow of the Crusades, we must confront the most profound, the most confounding aspect of these arduous journeys, the why. What was it that propelled ordinary men and women behind everything they knew to face unimaginable hardship and to march towards a distant, often mythical land? Of time reveals that the answer, far from being a simple economic or political calculation, deeply in the spiritual soil of the era. For the vast majority, the driving force was not a lust for conquest or a thirst for riches, though those elements certainly played their part for some. No, primary motivation was a profound, often visceral belief in a divine mandate. You see, of a holy duty permeated the medieval worldview. The journey to the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule, merely a military campaign. It was a pilgrimage, an act of penance, a direct service to God himself. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II, at the Council of Clermont, delivers a sermon that ignites a continent. His words, we only have them in accounts written later, were a thunderclap. He spoke of the desecration of holy sites, of the suffering of Christians in the East, and he offered a powerful incentive: remission of sins. A society deeply preoccupied with the afterlife, with the eternal consequence of sin. This was a potent lure. In the Crusades was to offer oneself as a soldier of Christ, a spiritual warrior whose every hardship, every wound, every drop of sweat was a form of penance, a step closer to salvation. You wake up, not to the gentle chime of a modern alarm, crowing of a rooster, that sounds impossibly loud, piercing the thin walls of your humble dwelling. The air is cool, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp straw and the sharper tang of wood smoke from a nearby hearth. Your stomach rumbles, that has become a familiar companion. You pull on your tunic, the rough-spun wool scratching against your skin, the soft linens you might imagine. Your hands, calloused and work-worn, reach for a chunk of hard bread and a sliver of cheese, the meager fare that will sustain you for the day. Outside, the village is already stirring. You hear the clatter of wooden buckets, cattle, the distant bleating of sheep. The preacher's words from last Sunday still echo in your mind. A holy city of the sacred relics of the faithless who defiled them. He spoke of the Pope's decree, promise a paradise for those who took up the cross. You look at your neighbor, a farmer named Thomas, with the same mixture of fear and fervent hope that you feel in your own chest. Are you truly considering it, John? You ask, thee with dessous and the lingering dust of sleep. Thomas nods, his eyes fixed on the distant, hazy horizon. The father spoke of a great sin I committed many years ago. This is a chance to cleanse it, to serve him directly. My wife, she weeps, but she understands. It is for our souls, is it not? He grips the rough wooden cross hanging from his neck, his knuckles white. You nod. Apprehension tightens in your gut. You've heard the stories. Whispers carried by returning pilgrims, disease that swept through armies like a scythe, of thirst that cracked lips and withered bodies, of battles where men fell like wheat before the reaper. You've seen the vacant eyes of those who returned, their bodies broken, hollowed by the sheer, unrelenting brutality of the journey. The passage of time reveals that the initial religious fervor, unadulterated call to arms, often became entangled with earthly realities very quickly. The promise of divine favor was a powerful motivator, but it did little to fill an empty stomach or ward off the plague. Self was a crucible, a brutal test of faith and endurance. I discovered in the archives, in a dusty ledger from the Abbey of Saint Denis, a letter penned by a humble monk named Brother Anselm. Early 12th century, he writes of his own experiences joining a contingent of pilgrims. His descriptions are heart-wrenching. Stench of unwashed bodies packed together on ships, the constant gnawing hunger, the agonizing thirst, seeing men succumb to dysentery, their bodies racked with pain, their prayers turning to desperate pleas for a swift end. Of the sheer terror of storms at sea, the fear that gripped them as their flimsy vessels were tossed about like toys by the unforgiving waves. The sea, he wrote, his script shaky as a hungry maw, and it swallows many of God's chosen. We are but ants upon its surface, mercy of its wrath. You can almost feel the salt spray on your face, the icy grip of fear as the ship pitches violently. You hear the screams of the terrified, the splintering of wood, the roar of the wind. Was not the glorious march of knights you might have envisioned. This was a desperate, often chaotic, struggle for survival, fueled by a faith that was being tested to its very limits. Of time reveals that the perception of a holy duty was not confined to the nobility or the knights. Peasants, artisans, women and children felt this call. They sold their meager possessions, kissed their families goodbye. The ranks of the faithful, driven by a hope that transcended the grim realities of their lives. By undertaking this arduous journey, by suffering, and perhaps even dying for Christ, sacred obligation, this wasn't just about reclaiming a city, it was about securing their eternal place in heaven. Consider the story of a woman named Adeliza, a baker's wife from a small village in Normandy. Her husband, a devout man, illness leaving her with 2 young children, and a mountain of debt. When the call for the third crusade went out, she saw it not as a death sentence, but as a path to salvation for her entire family. She sold her small bakery, her most prized possession, her children clinging to her skirts. She joined a band of pilgrims heading east. Her journey, as documented in fragmented chronicles, immense hardship. She faced starvation, exposure, and the constant threat of violence. Yet her faith, belief in the divine purpose of her pilgrimage, sustained her. She saw her suffering as a form of prayer, a testament to her devotion. The passage of time reveals that while the spiritual impetus was paramount, earthly realities were a constant brutal counterpoint. The very act of traveling, of moving across vast distances in a pre-modern world, an undertaking fraught with peril. The motivations, however noble, could not shield you from the gnawing hunger, tainting diseases, the sheer physical exhaustion. And as we continue our journey, Whispers will explore precisely how these earthly sufferings began to chip away at even the most fervent of faiths. Period dramas, the truth is far more fascinating. You think of the Crusades as a grand departure, quest across sun-drenched plains. But before you even saw the glint of steel against a distant horizon, before the fervor of the preached word truly took hold, there was the life you knew, the familiar, the comforting, brutal reality of your European home. It's easy to romanticize the departure, to focus on the shimmering promise of Jerusalem. Horror of that journey lies in what was left behind and what was irrevocably altered. Your world, as you knew it, was a tapestry woven with threads of both deep faith and grinding hardship. Imagine waking not to the soft hum of a refrigerator, sharp, insistent crow of a rooster, its cry piercing the thin, straw-stuffed walls of your cottage. The air, even in summer, earthy scent of the soil, mingled with the ever-present aroma of wood smoke and the less pleasant tang of animal dung. Your floor would be packed earth, cool and gritty beneath your bare feet. Sunlight, when it managed to penetrate the small, unglazed window, dusty shafts illuminating the rough, hewn furniture, a sturdy wooden table, a bench, a simple chest for your meager possessions. Gradually, you realize the sheer physicality of this existence. Your hands, from tending the fields or working the forge, would know the rough texture of homespun wool against your skin. The food, while perhaps hearty, was often monotonous. A thick, dark bread, sour from imperfect fermentation, was a staple. Stews simmered over open hearths, filled with whatever seasonal vegetables, and scraps of meat could be procured: turnips, cabbage, onions, salted pork, if you were fortunate. The taste was often earthy, sometimes bland, and the texture, depending on the cooking time, could range from tender to stubbornly chewy. Consider the sounds: the clatter of wooden bowls, murmur of prayers before the morning meal, the distant bleating of sheep on the hillside. In the larger towns, cacophony would increase: the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the sharp cries of street vendors hawking their wares, the lowing of oxen pulling carts laden with goods, the stench of tanning hides, of unwashed bodies, of refuse left in the streets would be a constant olfactory companion. This was not a sanitized, idealized past. This was a world of raw, unvarnished existence. Of your family, your community, the bonds were tight, forged by shared labor and mutual dependence. You knew your neighbors' strengths and their weaknesses. There was a predictable rhythm to life, dictated by the seasons and the church calendar. Every Sunday, the incense sweet and cloying in the cool stone interior of the local parish church, The priest, Father Thomas, with his booming voice and stern pronouncements, was a central figure, his sermons a blend of spiritual guidance and practical admonitions. Let's step into a small, simulated scene. Bustling market square in, say, a town like Rouen in the year 1095. The air is thick with the smell of roasted meats, pungent aroma of cheeses. A baker, his face dusted with flour, calls out the virtues of his fresh loaves. Nearby, of brightly dyed wool, the colours surprisingly vibrant, madder red, woad blue, weld yellow. Approach a spice seller, his stall laden with exotic-looking sacks. "Good day, sir," you might say, your voice a little hesitant. Wondrous smelling powder. But the seller, a shrewd man with eyes that miss nothing, smiles. "Ah, my friend, that is saffron. Pinch of this can transform the humblest dish into a feast fit for a king, imported all the way from the east." He offers you a tiny pinch on the tip of a wooden spoon. The aroma is intoxicating, floral and earthy all at once. Taste the richness it would impart to a simple pottage. "And the price?" you inquire. "No ready will likely be beyond your reach. A fair price for such a treasure," he replies, "some that makes your stomach clench. But for a traveller, perhaps we can discuss a special arrangement." Gradually, limitations of your world. The horizon was often defined by the next village, the next market town. Journeys beyond your immediate region were arduous, fraught with peril. Roads were often little more than rutted tracks, wet seasons and dusty in the dry. Travel by foot was the norm for most, or perhaps a donkey if you were fortunate. For the relatively well-off, a horse was a significant investment. In the archives of a monastery near Cluny, that a single journey of 100 miles could take a week or more. On the terrain and the conditions, the risk of highway robbery was ever present. Bandits, desperate men driven by hunger or greed, forests and along lonely stretches of road. You learn to travel in groups, to keep your valuables hidden. Be constantly vigilant. Consider the food you would carry on such a journey. Dried meat, hard biscuits that could break a tooth, waterskin filled with water that might not always be clean. The concept of readily available clean water was a luxury. Fell ill from contaminated sources, their bodies already weakened by the rigors of the road. Let's think about clothing. Be simple, a linen or wool tunic, leggings or hose, and sturdy leather shoes or boots. For a journey, you might add a heavier cloak to protect against the elements, perhaps a leather jerkin for added protection. Might wear finer fabrics dyed in richer colors, and perhaps even some mail or plate armor if they were knights. Fabrics were woven by hand, dyed with natural pigments, and required constant mending. Neatly pressed suit or a waterproof jacket would be utterly alien. Then there's the matter of lodging. For most, offering little more than a straw froll, filled pallet, and a shared meal, might find more comfortable accommodations, but the concept of a private room with a lock on the door was not commonplace. Sanitation was, to put it mildly, rudimentary. I recall reading a letter from a pilgrim in the 12th century describing his journey to Rome. He spoke of the constant damp, the biting cold that seeped into his bones, even in what should have been milder seasons, fear of illness. He mentioned sharing a room with a dozen other men, all coughing and restless with the smell of sweat and stale breath. A food as barely fit for swine, a common sentiment among those undertaking long journeys. Gradually, the sheer scale of what you are leaving behind. Not just your physical home, but the very fabric of your known existence. The familiar faces, the predictable routines, the scents and sounds that, despite their harshness, were the anchors of your identity. You are trading the certainty of a difficult life for the terrifying uncertainty of an even more difficult one. Faith that demands immense sacrifice. The comfort of the known, however humble, is a powerful force. Its absence on the road ahead would be a constant, gnawing ache. This departure wasn't just a physical movement. It was an uprooting of the soul, a severing of ties to everything that made life, in its own way, survivable. Behind was not a gilded cage, but a cage they understood, and the freedom that beckoned was a terrifying unknown, where the very air might be poison. What if I told you that everything you thought you knew about this period was incomplete? The gilded tapestries and the romantic ballads, the journey you're about to embark on that leads to the supposed Holy Land is less a pilgrimage of faith and more a brutal, desperate scramble through a world that actively sought to break you. You've heard the whispers, the fervent prayers, the songs of divine promise, but the reality of the road itself, the sheer unadulterated awfulness of it, history often glosses over. We've touched upon the familiar hardships of European life, the damp chill, the gnawing hunger, present threat of disease. Now, we venture further into the heart of a landscape that offers no solace, amplification of every fear you've ever harbored. The very air you breathe will change, growing heavier, hotter, with the dust of countless forgotten souls. This is not a journey for the faint of heart, nor for those who cling to illusions. Unvarnished truth of why traveling sucked in the Crusades. And believe me, you are going to be horrified. The weeks pass and you discover that the verdant fields and familiar forests of home are a distant memory that becomes increasingly alien and unforgiving. The air, once crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, hangs heavy and stagnant, carrying the dry, acrid tang of sun-baked earth and the faint, metallic odor of sweat and fear. No longer traversing well-trodden paths, these are tracks, often little more than faint impressions in the parched soil, desolate scrubland and across barren, rocky plains. The sun, a benevolent presence in the northern skies, a relentless, oppressive fury. Its rays, unfiltered by cloud or canopy, bake the very ground you walk on, radiating heat that seems to leach the moisture from your very bones. You feel it on your skin, a persistent, stinging touch that leaves your lips cracked and your eyes perpetually watering. The colors of the world shift too. Greens and blues of home fade into muted ochres, dusty browns, and the bleached white of sun-bleached bone. The silence here is not peaceful. It's a vast, unnerving emptiness punctuated by the rasping breath of your companions and the ceaseless drone of unseen insects. You huddle with a small group under a meager patch of shade cast by a scraggly, thorn-covered bush. In your waterskin is warm, tasting faintly of leather and desperation. Brother Thomas, his face gaunt and streaked with grime, hacking sound that echoes in the stillness. Another day, another mile closer to what precisely, he rasps, laudable. His eyes, once bright with religious fervor, now hold a weary resignation. Jerusalem would be a city of gold, a beacon of God's grace. Instead, it feels like we are walking into a furnace, only the promise of fire at the end. You nod, your own throat raw. The bread you chew is hard and dry, dust and the faint bitterness of whatever grain was available. It offers little sustenance, a temporary lull in the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. Beside you, Anya, a young woman who joined the pilgrimage with her husband, her face hidden in her hands. Her husband, a blacksmith from a village near Tours, fell ill days ago and was left behind. Your waking thoughts. He promised we would see the Holy Sepulchre together. She whispers, choked with grief, "Now I walk alone." The very ground beneath you feels hostile. The stones are sharp and unforgiving, the thin soles of your worn leather boots. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, the sour tang of stale sweat, present unsettling scent of animal dung. You notice the way the birds, when they appear, are often carrion eaters, stark against the blinding sky. This is not the pastoral idyll of your dreams. This is a harsh, unforgiving reality. You recall a conversation you overheard earlier that week between two seasoned travelers who had attempted this journey before. The Saracens aren't the only enemy out here. One of them, a grizzled man named Jayan, had muttered, spitting onto the parched earth. It's the land itself that tries to kill you. The heat, the thirst, the sickness that creeps into your bones like a serpent. The locals, they don't welcome us, not like the poets sing. They see us as invaders, as a threat, if the price is right. But trust them. Never. His companion, a younger man with a haunted look, had added, "I saw a man, a strong man, just waste away. One day he was marching, the next he was delirious, babbling about angels, and then gone." The desert takes its toll, you see. It strips away everything you are until there's nothing left but a husk. You remember the meticulous planning that went into equipping your own small band, but ultimately inadequate woolen tunics that offered little protection from the sun's glare, the leather boots that still wore thin with every agonizing step, the precious ration stores of dried meat and hardtack. Far too quickly, you had studied maps rudimentary as they were of the routes through Anatolia and Syria, convey the sheer scale of the desolation, the vast distances between any semblance of civilization, fear of ambush, or simply being lost. You had heard tales of prosperous cities along the way, of welcoming caravanserais. Reality you were experiencing was a stark contrast, a landscape of scarcity and suspicion. Pass and you discover that the shared faith, the very thing that propelled you forward, often becomes a source of friction over the proper interpretation of Scripture, over who is more devout, over the dwindling resources, a heated argument between a fiery preacher and a pragmatic farmer over the allocation of the remaining water. The preacher, flushed with righteous indignation, claims that God will provide, that their faith should be their sustenance. The farmer, hollow with exhaustion and fear, points to the parched throats of the children and the emaciated bodies of the horses. "Doesn't quench thirst, Father," he says, his voice laced with a bitterness that chills you. "Fill an empty belly." You learn that the concept of a unified Christian front was, at best, a fragile ideal. Simmer between the different contingents, the French knights, the German foot soldiers, pilgrims, each with their own customs, their own leaders, and their own growing resentments. You find yourself yearning for the simple, familiar hierarchy of your own community, for the clear roles and expectations of home. Here, blur, and the authority of any one person is constantly challenged by the sheer, overwhelming pressure of survival. You remember reading about the Byzantine Empire, a powerful entity that controlled much of the territory you were traversing, a grand reception, a welcoming embrace from fellow Christians. Instead, you encounter a wary populace, resentful of the influx of armed foreigners, their own resources strained. The Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, you'd encountered in historical accounts, was a distant figure, concerns likely more about maintaining his own precarious empire than about the spiritual well-being of your ragtag army. The weeks pass and you discover that the promised land itself when you finally catch glimpses of it in the hazy distance, is not the verdant paradise you envisioned. It is a land scarred by conflict, by centuries of shifting allegiances and territorial disputes. Seems to carry the weight of past battles, the phantom cries of fallen soldiers. You see fortifications stark and imposing, strategic hillsides, a testament to the constant state of alert. Settlements you pass are not welcoming havens, but fortified outposts, their inhabitants wary of strangers. The scent of wood smoke, a comforting aroma of home, now carries a hint of anxiety, of vigilance. You learn that the local populations, whether Christian, Muslim, have their own lives, their own traditions, and their own reasons for distrusting this massive, unruly influx of outsiders. Fervor that drove you from Europe begins to feel naive, almost foolish. Stark realities of resource scarcity, political instability, and the sheer, unyielding harshness of the environment. Understand that the dream of Jerusalem was perhaps just that, a dream, a powerful motivator that obscured a far more brutal, ultimately disappointing truth. The journey itself, the arduous, soul-crushing trek, was the real test, and the destination, when it finally loomed, was not a reward but merely the next stage of an ongoing ordeal, with a growing sense of dread that the hardships you've endured thus far are merely a prelude to the trials that await, a chilling foreshadowing of the disillusionment to come. Your subpart must begin with this exact phrase, then continue naturalis. I've studied paint a picture that's both more mundane and more extraordinary. The documents I've studied paint a picture that's both more mundane and more extraordinary than the heroic sagas often recounted. Whisper of the sheer grinding and often comical incompetence that plagued the early stages of the great expeditions, the gleaming armor and the thunderous charges for a moment, and instead, imagine the chaos that erupted the very instant the decision was made to Evevgov. You've heard the pronouncements, fervent calls to arms echo from pulpits, and now the time has come to actually move. But where is the grand, unified force, meticulously planned logistics? Question you'll find yourself asking with increasing desperation as you stand on the muddy outskirts of wherever this grand endeavor is meant to originate. With the smell of unwashed bodies, stale bread, and nervous sweat does little to inspire confidence. It's not the scent of holy purpose, but of a poorly managed camp before a storm. You expected banners unfurling, blaring a clear call to march. Instead, you hear the bleating of sheep, the squawking of chickens being herded with little success, murmur of confused voices. The sheer, unadulterated disorganization is the first, most suffocating hardship, a heavy blanket woven from indecision and a profound lack of foresight. This isn't a well-oiled war machine. It's a sprawling, bewildered herd. The months teach you that the initial step is often the most treacherous, not because of enemy swords, because of your own. You've spent weeks, perhaps months preparing. You've sold land, gathered what meager savings you possessed, the rough-spun tunic and cloak that signify your commitment. You've heard tales of the Holy Land, of its golden cities and sacred relics, but the reality of leaving is far more visceral. The first hurdle isn't a Saracen cavalry charge, sheer overwhelming problem of getting there. The organization, if one could call it that, is a patchwork quilt of local lords, contingent, their own ideas, and their own equally ill-equipped followers. There's no central command, supply chain. You see men arguing over who gets the slightly less rotten sack of grain as they try to coax recalcitrant donkeys laden with pots and pans, and children clinging to their mothers, mixture of fear and bewildered excitement. Your own allocated supplies are laughable, a rough wool blanket, leeks, and a small pouch of hardtack biscuits, so dry they could break your teeth. You'd expected provisions for weeks. Instead, you have enough for a few days, and even then, the quality is questionable. Monastic Chronicles of St. Gall dating from around 1105, participants were forced to sell their possessions simply to acquire basic necessities at exorbitant prices from opportunistic local traders who saw the desperate influx of pilgrims as a prime opportunity for profit. This wasn't a noble provision, it was a desperate, last-minute scramble. You find yourself standing next to a burly man named Thomas, weathered, and his hands calloused from years of tilling the soil. He's clutching a crudely fashioned spear, slightly sharpened. "They said we'd have proper rations," he grumbles, kicking at a loose stone with his worn boot. "Salted pork, cheese, enough wine to keep the spirits up. This is barely enough to keep the hunger pangs at bay for a single day." He gestures with his chin towards a pile of sacks, some of which are clearly infested with weevils. The smell emanating from them is a sickly, sweetish decay. You nod, giving an uneasy lurch. Nearby, a woman, her face etched with worry, is trying to barter a small silver crucifix for a handful of dried beans. She's dressed in a patched linen gown, rough cloth. "My son," she whispers to a passing cleric, her voice cracking. Her needs proper sustenance for this journey already. The cleric, a man with a stern face and eyes that seem to have seen too much suffering already, perfunctory blessing and moves on, his own meager provisions clutched tightly. This is the reality. Scramble for survival before the actual journey has even truly begun. You see the glint of desperation in everyone's eyes, a stark contrast to the pious fervor that had propelled them here. The dream of Jerusalem, of salvation, tarnished by the brutal, unromantic truth of insufficient planning and even more insufficient supplies. A conversation between two knights, their armor polished but their faces grim. "My men," one says, low and strained. "They've been given half rations since yesterday. We were promised we'd be provisioned at the next staging post, be anything left by the time we get there." The other nods, his jaw tight. "The lords are hoarding what they can. They simply don't have enough to share. Either way, it's the common folk who will suffer first." It's a grim prophecy. Truth settle in your gut like a cold stone. The Grand March, meant to be a testament to faith, is already revealing itself as a testament to human fallibility and the harsh realities of resource management, or the utter lack thereof. Teach you that the most profound lessons are often the ones delivered through sheer, unadulterated hardship. You've seen the grand pronouncements, the fiery sermons, the fervent vows made before the altars of countless churches. Yourself a valiant soldier of Christ, striding purposefully towards the Holy Land. But now, standing here, amidst the mud, the confusion and the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, you realize the true nature of this undertaking. Jew journey is not just a matter of miles covered, it is a test of endurance against the very shortcomings of those who organized it. Of adequate food and water, the poorly maintained equipment, any real structure, these are the invisible enemies you face from the very first step. You look at the faces around you, the hope slowly draining away, replaced by a dawning realization of the monumental task ahead and the utter inadequacy of their preparations. This is just the beginning. You understand with a chilling certainty, the road to Jerusalem is paved not just with good intentions, with the broken bodies and weary spirits of those who were ill prepared for its brutal reality. What awaits you further down this path? Initial excitement has long since evaporated, and the true, unvarnished suffering begins. The thought sends a shiver down your spine, premonition of the trials yet to come. The further back we go, the more we realize how much courage ordinary life required. Is this more starkly illustrated than in the sheer, unvarnished reality of medieval travel for those undertaking the monumental, often fatal, journey of the Crusades? Romanticized images of knights in shining armor trotting elegantly on steeds through sun-dappled forests. The truth, as revealed by the fragmented accounts, the gnawed bones of evidence, and the very earth itself, to human endurance against a landscape actively hostile to movement. Your understanding of these journeys begins not with a grand departure, but with a grinding, shattering discomfort that permeated every waking moment. Day by day, you learn that the roads of the 11th and 12th centuries were, for the most part, relics of past empires, worn tracks dictated by the most practical routes between settlements, the vast network of paved Roman roads. Marvel of engineering that once connected an empire had by the time of the First Crusade, ton 95 and 99, largely fallen into disrepair. If you will, a surface that was once smooth and engineered for efficiency, now fractured, overgrown, and often impassable. These ancient arteries into viscous, sucking bogs. In dry spells, they became choked with dust, particulate that coated everything, settling in your throat, burning your eyes, and clinging to your skin with a persistent. Your feet, encased in rough leather boots that offered little protection against the relentless impact, bone, weary throb. Each step was an effort. The ground was rarely level, a treacherous terrain of ruts carved by countless wagon wheels and animal hooves, deep enough to twist an ankle or break a leg. Rocky outcrops exposed roots of ancient trees that had long since reclaimed the edges of the path and sudden were constant hazards. You learned to watch your step with an almost primal intensity. Inattention could lead to a fall, a lost pack, or a serious injury that, in this era, often meant a slow, painful end. Self was a physical entity. In the summer months, the heat beat down relentlessly until it cracked and shimmered with mirages. The sun, through the dust and the canopy of trees that often crowded the path, was a harsh, unforgiving eye. Hydration was a constant threat. Water sources were scarce and often suspect. You learned to eye streams with suspicion, remembering the tales of tainted wells and the sickness that could follow a single gulp of contaminated water. The taste of lukewarm, carried in a leather water skin that imparted its own earthy flavor, became your only solace. In contrast, its own unique brand of misery. Freezing rain turned the pathways into slick, treacherous sheets of ice. Snow, when it fell, tracks entirely, forcing you to rely on instinct and the faint memory of the route. The biting wind, modern insulation, would cut through your woolen garments like a blade, chilling you to the bone. Toes would go numb, making it difficult to manipulate your pack or even grip your walking staff. The dampness, evasive presence that seeped into everything made it impossible to truly dry out. The sheer weight of your belongings was a constant burden. You carried your food, your meager possessions, and perhaps a weapon. Average pilgrim or soldier, this meant a pack that could weigh upwards of 50 pounds. Imagine wearing that for days, weeks, months on end over uneven, unforgiving ground. Your shoulders would ache, your back would scream in protest. Straps would chafe your skin raw. The constant shifting of weight, the need to adjust your load, an ingrained part of your existence. I discovered in the archives of a monastery in Burgundy letters from a participant in the Second Crusade. I was 1147 1149. One passage written by a simple peasant named Guillaume, described his journey through the Balkans. He spoke not of grand battles or pious pronouncements, but of the perpetual ache in his legs, the blisters that covered his feet like a second skin, gnawing hunger that even the meager rations of hardtack and dried meat couldn't fully appease. He wrote of the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present odor of animal dung that clung to the air, testament to the sheer volume of people and beasts traversing these same paths. Day by day, you learn that communal living offered little comfort. You slept in makeshift camps, huddled together for warmth and protection. The ground, with a thin straw mattress, if you were lucky, offered little respite. The sounds of the night were a cacophony of restless sleepers, the occasional whinny of a horse, and the ever-present rustling of unseen creatures. The fear of attack, or desperate local populations who saw the passing armies as a source of plunder, was a constant, level thrum beneath the surface of your wariness. Consider the clothing. It was practical, designed for durability rather than comfort. Rough-spun wool tunics, belted at the waist, and woolen hose were the norm. Leather shoes, often ill-fitting, were all that stood between your feet and the brutal terrain. In colder weather, you might add a cloak, also of wool, provided some protection, but became heavy and sodden when wet. The lack of modern ventilation meant that in warm weather, stifling. In cold weather, it was often insufficient, and the constant wear and tear meant that your garments were rarely clean, harboring the grime and sweat of weeks of travel. The food, when available, was monotonous and often unappetizing. Hardtack, a hard to last, was a staple. Dried meats, salted fish, whatever vegetables could be foraged or purchased were added to the diet. Fresh fruit and vegetables were a luxury, quickly consumed. Proper cooking facilities meant that meals were often simple, boiled or roasted over open fires. The taste was often bland, texture uninspiring, but it provided the necessary fuel to keep moving. Imagine a conversation overheard between two pilgrims, a particularly grueling stretch through Anatolia in 1097 during the First Crusade. Jean, his face streaked with dust and sweat, slumped against a rock. "My feet," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "Feet have forgotten what it means to be soft. They feel like stone now, and as unfeeling as the ground beneath us." Pierre, who had been tending to a festering wound on his leg, nodded grimly. "Mine too. The water it tastes of the earth and of fear. I pray to God we reach Antioch soon. My spirit is willing, my body is breaking." Their words, though simple, paint a visceral picture of the physical toll. Day by day, the landscape itself was a character in this epic of suffering. The pathways were not mere conduits for movement, participants in the ordeal. They were muddy, dusty, rocky, and treacherous. They were narrow, forcing you into single file, the sense of being trapped in a slow, moving, weary procession. The sheer effort of putting one foot in front of the other. Day under the weight of your possessions and the crushing weight of your own fatigue was an immense undertaking, was a testament to a different kind of courage, one born not of battlefield valor, but of sheer, unyielding perseverance against the relentless, brutal, and often soul-destroying nature of the road. This relentless physical attrition was not a minor inconvenience, it was a fundamental aspect of the Crusades, experience and often determining the fate of those who embarked upon them. True horror of these journeys lay not in the grand pronouncements of faith or the clash of armies, but in the slow, agonizing erosion of the human body and spirit, played out on the unforgiving stage of medieval pathways. And this, the sheer, unglamorous, reality of movement is only the beginning of understanding why traveling truly sucked in the Crusades. What lay ahead, immediate suffering of the journey itself, was a different kind of challenge, one that would test the very fabric of their faith and their resolve. You've probably heard romanticized tales about this period was far more complex, especially when it came to the most basic of needs, sustenance, and the triumphant banners you've seen in illuminated manuscripts or imagined from heroic ballads. Imagine gnawing emptiness in your stomach, a persistent, dull ache that never truly subsided. This wasn't a fleeting hunger as a constant companion, a shadow that lengthened with every weary mile. You are part of a vast, unwieldy host, tapestry woven from the desperate, the devout, and the simply adventurous, all bound for a distant, hallowed land. Itself is a slow, relentless unraveling of the body and spirit, and at its heart lies the brutal truth of food, or rather, experience becomes your chore teacher, and the first lesson it imparts is about the sheer, unyielding scarcity. Optimism, fueled by the promises of provisions and the fervor of religious duty, quickly evaporates like dew under a harsh sun. The carefully rationed biscuits, hard as stones and often riddled with weevils, become a precious commodity. You try to chew them, to break your teeth. You soak them in water, turning them into a gritty, unappetizing paste. The taste is stale, earthy, unpleasant bitterness that clings to your tongue. Beside you, a young man named Thomas, his face gaunt and etched with premature lines, stares at his meager portion as if it were a king's feast. Another day, another battle against the crumbs, he mutters, his voice raspy. You nod, your own stomach a hollow cavern. The supply lines, threads stretching back across continents, are as vulnerable as a spiderweb in a storm. Bandits, treacherous terrain, logistical nightmares conspire to ensure that what little food is gathered rarely reaches the common soldier in adequate amounts. Finally arrives, it's a chaotic scramble. The air fills with the shouts of men desperate for sustenance, the clatter of dented pots, and the acrid smell of wood smoke from the hurried cooking fires. You manage to acquire a handful of dried beans, requiring hours of simmering over a sputtering flame to become remotely edible. The broth is thin, watery, of dirt and desperation. You see a woman, Alara, her normally rosy cheeks now sunken, trying to coax a few calories from a handful of foraged roots, their bitter taste making her grimace. At least it's something, she whispers, more to herself than to anyone else. You understand. Anything is better than the gnawing void. Body is profound. Your strength wanes, your limbs grow heavy, and your mind, once sharp with purpose, clouded by a constant dull fatigue. The vibrant colors of the world seem to fade, replaced by a muted palette of browns and greys. The subtle changes in others, the vacant stares, the shuffling gait, the increased irritability that flares into sudden, senseless anger. Malnutrition isn't just a word in a dusty tome, it's a visible, tangible plague that sweeps through the ranks. You see men, powerful warriors, reduced to skeletal figures, their skin stretched taut over bone, their eyes sunk deep in their sockets. They cough, hacking sound that echoes through the camp at night, a testament to weakened lungs. I discovered in my research fragmented chronicles and personal letters from those who endured this ordeal. That entire contingents would simply disintegrate enemy action, but from starvation and the diseases that prey on weakened bodies. The dysentery, constant and debilitating companion, turns the already scarce water sources into conduits of further suffering. Protein leads to scurvy, its telltale signs: bleeding gums, aching joints, lethargy becoming tragically common. you witness a man, a skilled carpenter named William, dreams of rebuilding holy sites, now struggling to lift a hammer, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He confides in you, barely audible. I can barely remember what it feels like to be full, to have energy. Feels like it's betraying me. The quality of the food, when it is available, is often appalling. Preserved meats, to get any, are rancid and crawling with maggots. The dried fruits are shriveled and tasteless. Even the bread, infested, is frequently moldy. You try to ignore the visual cues, the fuzzy green or white patches, solely on the desperate need to fill your belly. The smell of decay is a constant presence, sickly, sweet perfume that mingles with the dust and the sweat. You see a group of children brought along by their hopeful parents, and their bellies distended, a grim indicator of severe malnutrition. One little girl, no older than 7, a piece of dried, unidentifiable meat, her eyes wide and uncomprehending as she nibbles at it, oblivious to the rot. It's a scene that sears itself into your memory, a stark reminder of the innocence sacrificed. Struggle for food reshapes your priorities, your very sense of self. The grand pronouncements of faith, heavenly reward, begin to recede, replaced by the primal, urgent need for calories. You find yourself looking at your companions not as fellow pilgrims, but as potential competitors for the next major meal. Camaraderie, forged in shared hardship, are tested by the gnawing hunger. A hushed argument between 2 men over a handful of dried peas. Their voices roar with desperation. It's a stark contrast to the noble ideals that were supposed to propel this endeavor. The sheer physical toll is immense. Constantly, your skin is dry and cracked. You are perpetually cold, even in the midday sun. Internal furnace sputtering on insufficient fuel. The lack of proper nutrition affects your cognitive abilities too. Become sluggish. Your ability to concentrate diminishes. The vibrant tapestry of faith that once sustained you feels threadbare. Relentless assault of hunger. You remember reading about the ancient Roman legions, how they were meticulously supplied. Logistical chains, a marvel of organization. This is a chaotic, desperate scramble, trying to run a modern marathon on a diet of dust and regret. As the journey continues, the reality of starvation becomes an ever-present spectre. Men fall by the wayside, too weak to go on, their bodies left to the scavengers, their eyes glazed over, their last breaths shallow, their only regret, perhaps, not having had one more bite of bread. You find yourself rationing even the smallest morsel, chewing each mouthful with agonizing slowness. Last bit of sustenance. The taste, no matter how unpleasant, becomes a cherished sensation. Dream of food, of feasts you've never experienced, of the simple taste of fresh water from a clean well. Your pack feels heavier each day, not just with your meager possessions, but with the burden of your own failing body. The shimmering heat of the plains, the biting winds of the mountains, all exacerbate the problem. More energy than your body can possibly provide. Recognize the subtle signs of severe depletion in yourself and others, the sunken cheeks, the glazed eyes, trembling hands. You see a man, a former blacksmith, his powerful frame now emaciated, trying to light a fire with shaking fingers. Flint, it's no use. He whispers, his voice a dry rustle. My strength is gone. The hunger has taken it all. You offer him a few dried berries you've been hoarding, a gesture that feels both futile and necessary. Subpart has illuminated the grim reality of sustenance on the arduous journey of the past. Step in our exploration will delve into the pervasive threat of disease, a grim consequence of weakened bodies and unsanitary conditions, further compounding the horrors of travel. You've seen the movies, but the lived reality was something else entirely. Subpart 7 started to paint the picture. The immediate difficulties faced upon embarking on these epic journeys, then plunged you into the brutal nature of medieval roads and paths, a far cry from the paved highways we take for granted. Part 9, we began to illustrate the scarcity and poor quality of food, a constant gnawing hunger that would have been your unwelcome companion. But the challenges didn't end with dry rations and treacherous terrain. No, the very sustenance that should have kept you alive, giving liquid we often overlook, became one of the most insidious and pervasive threats on the long road to the Holy Land. About water, dear listener, not as a refreshing respite, but as a potential harbinger of death. Imagine this: the relentless sun beating down, your throat parched, a desperate thirst clawing at you. You finally stumble upon a stream, its surface shimmering, promising relief. But what lurks beneath that placid facade? As days blur into weeks, enthusiasm for the grand pilgrimage to the Levant, perhaps around the time of the First Crusade in 1095 or later during the tumultuous years of the Second Crusade, around 1147, 1149, under the persistent assault of physical hardship. You've marched for what feels like an eternity, boots worn thin, the rough wool of your tunic chafing your skin raw. The camaraderie you felt at the outset, divine purpose, is now overshadowed by the primal needs of survival. Hunger is a constant ache, as we touched upon, is a more immediate, a more visceral torment. You've learned to be wary of stagnant ponds, sicker with a sickly green film teeming with unseen life. But even flowing water, the very essence of life, I discovered in archives through fragmented chronicles and medical treatises of the era, just how little understanding there was of hygiene and the microscopic world. The concept of germs, of invisible agents of disease, centuries away. So when you encountered a river that had flowed through a densely populated area, perhaps passing by a settlement where sanitation was, to put it mildly, rudimentary, could be a cocktail of human and animal waste. Imagine a bustling town like Antioch, waypoint for many crusaders, situated along a river. While the city offered opportunities for resupply, were also likely conduits for everything that was discarded. That quenched your thirst could carry the seeds of devastating epidemics. Let's picture a scene. You're part of a larger contingent, perhaps moving through the Byzantine Empire. The year is, say, 1189, during the Third Crusade. You've been marching for days through the Anatolian plateau. The air is dry, dusty, and carries the faint smell of animal dung from your own baggage train. Your lips are cracked, your tongue feels like sandpaper. Companions are equally gaunt and weary. A young man named Thomas, a simple farmer from Kent, his wide with a mixture of fear and desperation, points ahead. "Look, water," he croaks, his voice raspy. You approach a stream with wilting reeds. The water flows, not fast, but it moves. You see small fish darting beneath the surface, a hopeful sign. You notice something else. A little further upstream, a group of pilgrims are washing their clothes, and discarded scraps of food being washed directly into the stream. Nearby, a cart carrying livestock has overturned, the faint, unpleasant odor of decaying animal matter. Brother Michael, a grizzled monk who has seen more of this world than most, approaches you, his hand resting on the hilt of a sturdy wooden staff. "Cautious, my son," he says, his voice a low rumble. "This water looks inviting, but the earth remembers all that has passed through it, is a breeding ground for unseen maladies. You, Thomas, however, is beyond caution." He kneels by the stream and drinks deeply. You hesitate, the monk's words echoing in your mind. The water is cool, surprisingly so. The relief is intoxicating. You can almost taste the clean, pure essence of it. But then, a nagging doubt. You remember the tales from those who have gone before, the sudden fevers, the debilitating stomach cramps, the rapid wasting away. Horror truly sets in. It wasn't just the battlefield that claimed lives. Insidious enemy that lurked in the very water you needed to survive. Diseases like dysentery, cholera, fever were rampant. They would strike without warning, turning strong men into weak, wreathing figures within days. The agony of a gut-wrenching illness, the constant nausea, the burning fever, the sheer exhaustion that made even lifting your head a Herculean task, and all this while still on the march from any semblance of medical care, with only the prayers of your companions and the scant knowledge of battlefield surgeons, who were more adept at stitching wounds than treating internal ailments. I recall reading a letter, a crusader in the early 12th century describing a devastating outbreak of sickness that swept through their camp. He spoke of men, strong and hale one day, dying in their tents the next, their bodies racked with fever and uncontrollable purging. He described the stench of sickness, the constant moaning, and the grim task of burying the dead, their numbers growing with alarming speed, that more men were falling to sickness than to the enemy's swords. This wasn't an exaggeration, it was the grim reality. Of course, is that water, the very symbol of purity and life, became a potent vector of death. Stark reminder of how vulnerable our ancestors were, how every sip of water was a gamble. Today, we turn on a tap and expect clean. We have water treatment plants, filtration systems, and a scientific understanding of pathogens. But for the Crusaders, the journey was a constant battle against thirst and a terrifying gamble. With every drop they consumed, this knowledge would have pressed down on you, a constant gnawing anxiety beneath the surface of your daily struggles. Learn to identify the signs of contaminated water, the peculiar smell, the cloudy appearance, but even then could override caution. This pervasive threat of waterborne illness would have profoundly impacted morale, even most devout pilgrim into a man riddled with fear. The journey was not just a physical test, but a psychological one, negotiation with the very elements that sustained life. And as you continued your arduous trek, the memory of those who succumbed to these unseen enemies would have been a chilling companion, testament to the brutal realities of travel in that era. The thirst would never truly go away, with the fear of what that thirst might drive you to drink. As you press on, the memory of that stream, fear of what you might have ingested, will linger. The next challenge, however, about what you drink and more about what you wear, and how that very clothing could become a source of misery. Mind drift back to an age when the very concept of normal was radically different, when the air itself seemed to hum with unseen threats, a stark contrast to the sanitized world we inhabit today. You wake up not to the gentle chime of an alarm, but to a gnawing discomfort in your gut, a chill that has nothing to do with the morning air. Wool of your tunic scratches against skin already raw from the grime of the road. The faint, acrid smell of unwashed bodies and stale sweat permeates everything, a constant unwelcome companion. Your throat is dry, your tongue thick and coated. You try to swallow, but it's a painful rasp. The world outside your meager shelter, erected tent of patched canvas or a hollowed out section of a fallen tree, is a symphony of misery. Coughs echo, whimpers of the sick, and the low murmurs of those tending to them. The dawn light finally breaches the oppressive darkness, does little to dispel the gloom. It merely illuminates the pallor on faces, the sunken eyes, listless limbs. This is not the romanticized march of warriors. This is a slow, agonizing surrender to an enemy that strikes without warning, without pity. You remember the last encampment? Scramble for any semblance of sanitation, attempts to boil water over sputtering fires that offered more smoke than heat. Well-intentioned efforts were often overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the suffering. Insidious reality of travel in this era, a reality where the greatest dangers lurked not in the clash of steel, but in the very air you breathed, the water you drank, the ground you trod. Understanding deepens as you consider the specific agents of this widespread suffering. Dysentery, a relentless scourge, was a constant companion on any extended journey. Imagine the sheer agony, the cramping, the burning, the incessant need to relieve yourself, yielding only blood and mucus. It was a swift and brutal dehydrator, weakening even the strongest constitutions, vulnerable to other ailments. The lack of proper sanitation meant that any water source, any communal latrine, breeding ground for the bacteria responsible, the very act of drinking, a necessity for survival, became a gamble. You'd see men, proud and robust, reduced to skeletal figures, their skins stretched taut over bone, their eyes vacant with pain, would cling to the air, a testament to the body's betrayal. Then there was typhus, or jail fever, carried by lice and fleas that thrived in the squalid conditions of crowded camps and ill-kept lodgings. The tiny, almost imperceptible itch, a precursor to the violent chills. The throbbing headache that felt as though your skull would split. Disorienting delirium that blurred the lines between reality and nightmare. Survivors often bore the scars, both physical and mental, of this relentless fever. I discovered in archives from the records of the Fourth Crusade 1:22-24 accounts detailing how disease, dysentery, decimated the ranks before any significant battles were even fought. The chroniclers speak of vast numbers succumbing to the bloody flux while still on ships or in their initial staging camps. It wasn't just the soldiers, the accompanying camp followers, the women and children were often the first and most severely affected. Precarious existence shattered by the relentless onslaught of illness and the plague. The spectre of the Black Death, devastating outbreaks would come later, was a known terror. Even earlier, it could sweep through armies with terrifying speed. The buboes, the swollen, agonizing lymph nodes, the fever, the delirium, the swift and inevitable march towards death. It was a horror that haunted the collective consciousness. Helplessness was crushing. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, based on superstition or the crude application of bloodletting and purging, which often did more harm than good. The primal terror of seeing your comrades fall, their bodies contorting in pain, their breath growing shallow, knowing that you too could be next, and there was virtually nothing anyone could do to stop it. Your understanding deepens as you witness the human toll firsthand. You're in a makeshift infirmary, a canvas tent with torn seams, with the cloying scent of herbs and the metallic tang of blood. Brother Thomas, whose hands are perpetually stained with poultices and bandages, is tending to a young man, no older than yourself, feverish pain. The man's eyes, when they flicker open, are wide and unfocused. Water, the young man croaks, a dry whisper. Brother Thomas gently lifts a wooden cup to his lips, the water within murky and suspect. Drink slowly, son. God's will be done. You watch, stomach churning with a mixture of pity and fear. You'd seen men die from less, You remember a conversation with a seasoned campaigner, a man named Gareth, his face a roadmap of old scars, his eyes holding a wary wisdom, the unseen enemy that takes the most. Gareth had said, spitting onto the dusty ground, "We can face a Saracen blade. We endure the hunger, the cold, but this rot from within, invisible poison, it breaks you before the enemy even sees you fall." He'd recounted a tale of a previous campaign where an entire company, with full strength, had been reduced to a handful of delirious survivors by a sudden outbreak of fever. They'd been so weakened, easily overrun by a small, raiding party. The irony was bitter, dying from the very act of trying to survive. You're sharing a meager meal, a thin gruel made from oats and whatever roots could be scavenged, with a fellow traveller, Alaric, his fingers ink stained and his eyes perpetually scanning the horizon, as if searching for an escape. "I heard they found a new spring near the river bend," Alaric offers, his voice low. "Clear, they say." You feel a flicker of hope extinguished. Clear water can still carry death, Alaric. Remember what happened at the last crossing? That seemingly pristine stream. They were the first to fall. You recall the hushed whispers, sickness, the grim realization that even the most beautiful natural source could be a vector for disease. Stark reminder of how fragile life was, how easily it could be extinguished by forces beyond comprehension. Modern medicine, sterile environments, and understanding of microbiology feels like a mythical realm, a world away from this brutal. Your understanding deepens as you contemplate the long-term consequences of these pervasive illnesses. Rectly kill thousands, but they also crippled armies, rendering them ineffective. With sickness could not march, could not fight, could not sustain itself. The morale plummeted, the resources were strained. Ultimate goals of the journey, whether religious pilgrimage or military conquest, became increasingly distant. The sheer logistical nightmare of managing sick and dying individuals in a moving army, without adequate medical facilities or knowledge, was overwhelming. It's a chilling thought. Majority of suffering and death on such expeditions often occurred not in glorious battle, but in the slow, agonizing decline of illness, a silent, unseen enemy that stalked every mile of the journey. And as the sickness spread, it wasn't just the soldiers who suffered, the civilian populations of the towns and villages they passed through were also at risk, inadvertently carrying the contagion further and wider, a tragic ripple effect of their passage. As the sun begins its descent, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape, you feel the familiar ache in your bones, the subtle tremor in your hands. Realities press in, a heavy blanket of despair, the sheer vulnerability of the human body in this era. Constant threat of unseen pathogens is a lesson etched into your very being. Glancing at the water skin with a renewed sense of dread, a silent prayer forming on your lips. Sunrise will bring not just light, insidious enemy that lurks in the very essence of your surroundings. Tomorrow the journey continues, and with it, present danger of the unseen. Most people think they understand this historical period, but nothing could be further from the truth. Picture gleaming armor, valiant chargers, and a steadfast faith propelling armies across continents. The gilded layers of legend, and you find a far grimmer reality, a tapestry woven with threads of desperation, suffering, present spectre of death. You've heard about the battles, the sieges, the grand declarations of holy purpose, the silent enemy, the one that struck without warning, indiscriminately, and with a ferocity that no shield could deflect, no sword could parry. This is the story of that enemy, the unseen terror that stalked the pilgrim and the warrior alike, full journeys into harrowing nightmares. Imagine the dust thick and cloying, coating your throat, the sun beating down on your exposed neck, the constant ache in your bones from endless marching. Now, discomfort amplified, twisted into something monstrous by a microscopic foe. Differently when the air itself can kill you. The Second Crusade launched in 1147. Massive influx of men and women drawn to the promise of reclaiming the Holy Land. A contingent marching through Anatolia, a region already ravaged by conflict and disease. The initial optimism, fervent sermons, and the shared belief in a righteous cause is beginning to fray. It's the summer of 1148, and the heat is oppressive, a thick, suffocating blanket. You've been traveling for months, your woolen tunic perpetually damp with sweat, fabric chafing your skin. The air smells of dry earth, animal musk, and something else, a faint sweetness that you can't quite place. Your companions, once boisterous and full of song, are now subdued, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. You're huddled with a small group near a meager fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the parched ground. The taste of stale bread and hard cheese, your meager rations, is a constant, unpleasant companion. Low moan from a man lying on a makeshift pallet nearby. His name is Thomas, a stonemason from Chartres. A few days ago, his laughter echoing through the camp. Now, his skin is stretched taut over his bones, his eyes are sunken, and dark splotches, tale sign of the plague, are appearing on his neck and under his arms. "Hey, he burns," whispers a woman named Agnes. Raspy, she's been tending to him, her own face etched with fear. Agnes, a widow who joined the Crusades seeking solace and a new life, is a skilled herbalist. Poultices and teas seem to have no effect against this relentless sickness, are out of balance. Mutters a grizzled soldier, Sir Kalen, his voice low and grim. The physicians say it's from the bad air, the miasma. He spits on the ground, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. A veteran of the First Crusade has seen his share of death, but he claims this is different. It moves like a shadow, unseen, unheard, until it's upon you. You remember the initial warnings, sensations about a sickness that had swept through Constantinople the previous year. Some dismissed it as a localized outbreak, setback. But here, in the heart of this vast, unforgiving land, it's becoming a palpable presence. You feel a prickling sensation on your skin, a tightness in your chest. You've been careful, trying to drink only boiled water, avoiding crowded settlements, but the sheer scale of the movement, the thousands of bodies packed together, creates an ideal breeding ground. Devastating outbreaks occurred during the siege of Antioch in 1098. The first Crusaders, immense hardship to reach the city, found themselves trapped within its walls, reinforcements, and facing a relentless Saracen counter-attack. It was then that the plague, bubonic plague carried by fleas on rats that had also sought refuge within the city, began its insidious work. Stench of death mingling with the stench of siege warfare, the smoke from burning siege engines, washed bodies of thousands of men, the rotting carcasses of horses. The sick were everywhere, their bodies racked with fever, in painful buboes, swollen lymph nodes that would turn black and then burst. I discovered in archives a vivid, if horrifying, account from Fulcher of Chartres, a chronicler of the First Crusade, how the sickness struck with such speed that men would fall dead in the streets, to rot because there were too few healthy to bury them. The fear was not just of dying, but of dying alone, abandoned. flesh consumed by a disease that seemed to defy all earthly remedies. The lack of sanitation was, of course, a major contributing factor. Were often overflowing, waste was dumped indiscriminately, and the general hygiene practices of the time were, by modern standards, this created a perfect storm for the plague to spread like wildfire. Time moves differently when the very concept of healing feels like a cruel joke. You've seen Agnes try to lance a bubo on Thomas's arm with a heated needle, attempt to release the bad humors. The resulting scream, a raw, agonizing sound, still echoes in your ears. The plague's grip was brutal. Symptoms often included high fever, chills, delirium, vomiting, and the characteristic blackening of the skin. The Black Death, though that term is more commonly associated with the devastating pandemic of the 14th century, outbreaks plagued earlier periods. The mortality rate was staggering, often exceeding 50% and in some instances reaching 90%. Encampments could be wiped out within weeks. You recall a conversation with a Saracen prisoner, a man named Tariq, captured during a skirmish. He spoke of a similar sickness that had afflicted his own people years before, of pestilence that stole the breath. He described how his entire family had succumbed, leaving him alone. He spoke with a quiet resignation that chilled you to the bone. "It is the will of Allah," he had said, his eyes ancient and weary. "But sometimes it feels like a test we are not meant to pass." His words offered no comfort, only a deeper sense of dread. Psychological toll was immense. Beyond the physical agony, there was the constant, gnawing fear. Every cough, every ache, usual sensation could be the harbinger of doom. The camaraderie that had once bound the Crusaders together began to fracture under the weight of this shared terror. Suspicion could arise who had been near the sick, who was carrying the contagion, was a far cry from the romanticized images of chivalry and brotherhood. It was a desperate struggle for survival, harvest reaped by an invisible hand. You look at your own hands, noticing a slight tremor. You've been careful. Pervasive nature of the disease is inescapable. The very act of traveling, of moving from one place to another, meant carrying the contagion with you, unknowingly spreading it to new communities. This wasn't just a threat to the crusading armies, threat to the very fabric of life in the regions they traversed. Imagine the fear in the eyes of a peasant woman in a small village as a group of weary, dust-caked pilgrims approached. Arrival might also bring the silent killer. The plague's impact wasn't limited to individual suffering. Profound strategic consequences. Outbreaks could decimate entire armies, forcing withdrawals, delaying campaigns, shattering morale. The Second Crusade, for instance, was ultimately a failure. Military miscalculations played a significant role. The ravages of disease undoubtedly contributed to its downfall. Manpower due to sickness was often greater than that sustained in battle. You can almost feel the weight of those lost lives, the dreams and aspirations extinguished by the plague's relentless advance. A stark reminder that even the most fervent faith and the sharpest steel were no match for the microscopic enemies that lurked in the shadows of this distant age. Time moves differently when the next step could be your last. As you prepare to rest, the sick are a constant reminder of the precariousness of your existence. The stars, so clear and distant, offer no solace, only a cold, indifferent beauty. Tomorrow you will march again, a little weaker, a little more afraid, unseen burden of a world where even the air could betray you. The journey continues. Ahead is shadowed by a fear far more insidious than any earthly foe. The scent of wood smoke drifts through your consciousness as we begin this journey, a familiar comforting aroma that belies the harsh realities we are about to explore. Imagine yourself not in a cozy inn, a makeshift shelter, the air thick with the acrid tang of damp wool and unwashed bodies, gnawing hunger, the festering wounds, the ever-present threat of unseen sickness. But now a new adversary emerges, the one as ancient and relentless as the earth itself, the weather. It's a force that, in an age without accurate forecasts or advanced shelter, turn an arduous pilgrimage into a swift descent into oblivion. Forget the romanticized images of gleaming armor and chivalrous deeds. Were a cruel, indifferent hand that frequently dealt the final blow. Slowly but surely, the sun begins its ascent with a gentle warmth, but with a searing intensity that promises a day of torment. This isn't a mild summer heat wave, oppressive, suffocating embrace of a Middle Eastern sun that drains the very lifeblood from your weary frame. You recall the accounts from the First Crusade, particularly the march through Anatolia in 1097. The sheer agony of this relentless solar barrage, the air shimmers with heat, already desolate landscape into a wavering mirage. Your rough-spun tunic, once a meager protection, that now clings to your skin like a second burning layer. The coarse wool, intended for warmth in cooler climes, becomes an oven and radiating it inwards. Every breath you draw is thick and dry, rasping in your throat. Your lips crack, tongue feels like sandpaper. Sweat, a precious commodity, pours from you in rivulets, almost instantly on your exposed skin, leaving behind a stinging residue of salt. Beneath your worn leather boots radiates heat, making each step an agony. You see men staggering, dangerous crimson, their eyes glazed with heat exhaustion. Water, if you're fortunate enough to have any, is a lukewarm, brackish affair, offering little relief and potentially exacerbating your thirst. The constant dehydration saps your strength, senses, and amplifies the gnawing fear that has become your constant companion. You might remember the desperate attempts to find shade, any sliver of respite from the sun's unforgiving gaze, under a meager tattered banner, or press yourself against the rough, sun-baked stone of a forgotten ruin. Is a distant dream. The very air seems to press down on you, a physical weight that makes every movement an Herculean effort. Subtle discomfort. This is a brutal assault on your very being, an enemy that requires no sword or shield to defeat. Slowly but surely, the seasons shift, and the sun's fury gives way to a different, equally deadly adversary, the biting. Imagine the brutal winter of the 1098 as the Crusaders found themselves in the mountainous regions of Syria. The transition from the heat of the day to the frigid embrace of the night is swift and unforgiving. Thin woolens offer little defense against the wind that whips through the rocky terrain, the promise of frostbite and hypothermia. The ground, once baked hard, is now frozen solid. To find shelter or even to dig a proper grave for the fallen. Your fingers numb and clumsy to fasten the meager ties on your tunic or to grip your weapon. The icy air burns your lungs with each inhale. Shiver racks your body, making sleep a near impossibility. Food, already scarce, even more difficult to prepare or even to chew when it's frozen solid. You witness men huddled together, pressed close for warmth, their breath misting in the frigid air. The lack of proper provisions, the inadequate clothing, sheer exhaustion of constant travel make them vulnerable. Frostbite, a silent thief, creeps into extremities, fingers black and lifeless. The stories of men losing limbs or succumbing to the cold in their sleep are not mere tales. The grim reality of this journey, the dampness that settles into everything, the the persistent chill that seeps into your very bones. Spirit, as much as it attacks the body, you might recall the desperate search for dry fuel, attempts to coax a fire to life in the biting wind, the gnawing ache of hunger amplified by the cold. The vast landscapes, often blanketed in snow or ice, stretch out before you, reminder of your insignificance in the face of nature's raw power. Slowly but surely, the skies themselves can turn against you. Violent storms that can erupt with little warning are a terrifying prospect. Imagine the journey through the desert regions. Sudden sandstorm can descend with terrifying speed, blinding you, choking you, and burying everything in its path. Your eyes sting, and the world becomes a swirling vortex of grit and sand. You can barely see the person standing next to you, the path ahead. The wind howls like a banshee, tearing at your meager possessions and threatening to rip your shelter apart. Flash floods, particularly in arid regions after a rare but powerful rain, seem like a blessing of water, can quickly turn into a deadly torrent, sweeping away men, animals, terrifying force. You hear the roar of the approaching water, a sound that chills you to the bone. For higher ground, your heart pounding in your chest. The rain itself, when it's not a deluge, can be a persistent. Days of unending downpour turn the ground into a muddy quagmire, making every step a struggle. Your boots sink deep into the muck, and the constant dampness breeds discomfort and disease. Your precious belongings become sodden and heavy. Air feels thick with moisture, leaving you perpetually chilled and miserable. Discovered in the Chronicles of Raymond of Aguilar's, a participant in the First Crusade, how sudden downpours and treacherous terrain hampered their progress. Simple river crossings into life-threatening challenges. He described how entire encampments were washed away. Dampness led to widespread illness amongst the soldiers. Stark reminder that even on the path to what was perceived as divine purpose, the mundane yet potent nature were ever present and often devastating. You might recall a specific moment, perhaps during the long march towards Antioch. Torrential downpour turned a relatively clear path into a treacherous river of mud. You see your companion, a stout yeoman named Thomas, struggling to keep his footing, his face a mask of grim determination as he fights against the clinging earth. Lashes down, obscuring your vision and chilling you to the bone, despite your layers of wool. The air is filled with the drumming of rain on canvas, the sucking sound of boots being pulled from the mud. Occasional curse or cry of frustration. Thomas slips, his legs splaying out from under him. You reach out, hands numb with cold, and manage to grab his arm, hauling him back to a more stable position. His face is streaked with mud and rain. Hold a flicker of gratitude. A foul day indeed. He gasps, his voice hoarse. Feels like it's trying to swallow us whole. You nod, unable to muster much more than a grunt in response. Sheer physical exertion required to simply move forward, coupled with the constant assault of the elements, is utterly exhausting. Simply lie down and surrender to the misery is a constant temptation. Yet, the shared suffering that everyone around you is enduring the same torment provides a fragile thread of camaraderie. It's in these moments, bare of all pretense and romanticism, that the true horror of this journey becomes most apparent. As the light begins to fade, distorted shadows across the sodden landscape, you can feel the weariness settling deep into your bones. In the air is a stark contrast to the scorching heat you might have endured just days before, testament to the unpredictable and brutal nature of this pilgrimage. The weather, in its myriad forms, was not merely an inconvenience. relentless enemy capable of breaking spirits and bodies with equal efficiency. It's a potent reminder that the path to the Holy Land was not just a test of faith and martial skill, but a brutal trial of human endurance against the unyielding forces of nature. Tomorrow, the sun might bake you, the wind might freeze you, the skies might weep torrents upon you, and you must be prepared for it all. In the quiet of your room, let's step into a world where silence had different meanings. The peaceful hush of a library or the comforting quiet of a sleeping home. This was the profound of being utterly, terrifyingly alone, a silence that pressed in on you, amplifying the thudding of your own heart. Imagine of a pre-dawn morning in the Holy Land, a place utterly alien to your senses. The stars overhead, a comforting blanket, now seem distant and indifferent, their light offering no solace in this vast, unknown expanse. You've been marching for weeks, perhaps months, under the scorching sun, battling not only the enemy, but the very land itself. Now, from your unit, the familiar clang of armor, the low murmur of your comrades, reassuring scent of their sweat and leather all gone, replaced by the rustle of unseen creatures in the scrub, whisper of the wind through thorny bushes, and the hollow echo of your own footsteps on the parched earth. Visceral reality of being lost, a fear that gnaws at the very core of your being, all pretense of bravery and leaving only raw vulnerability. As the seasons change, so too did the very definition of a journey. On the Crusades, the concept of travel was a brutal, unforgiving undertaking, a far cry from the curated experiences of modern tourism. The sheer act of traversing hundreds, even thousands, across unfamiliar and often hostile terrain was a testament to a profound, almost fanatical devotion. You find yourself disoriented, the sun your only reliable compass, having been obscured for days by dust storms or the thick canopy of an unforgiving forest. Rudimentary at best are useless here. They depict broad strokes of rivers and mountain ranges, but the intricate network of trails, the hidden springs, the treacherous ravines that could swallow a man whole, these are absent. You recall a conversation with a seasoned veteran and grizzled man named Brother Thomas, his face a roadmap of scars and sun-weathered wrinkles. The land itself is the greatest enemy, lad. He'd rasped, grinding stones. It doesn't care for your faith, your armor, or your king. Its simply edge is, if you let it. He described the Anatolian plateau, a vast expanse where the horizon seemed to stretch into infinity, and water was a precious, life-giving commodity. For days, the sun beating down like a smith's hammer, your throat raw and cracked, your tongue feeling like a swollen. You'd see mirages, shimmering lakes that vanished as you approached, taunting you with what you craved most. Finally found water, it was often brackish, thick with sediment, tasting of mud and despair. But you drank it, you had to. The alternative was a slow, agonizing death. Your own experience now mirrors these grim tales. Tunic clings to your sweat-soaked skin, the coarse wool chafing your shoulders. The leather of your boots, once supple, is now stiff and cracked, the soles worn thin from countless miles. You can feel the grit of the earth working its way into every crevice, but every fold of your clothing. The air, thick with the scent of dry dust and the faint, acrid smell of animal droppings, offers no refreshment. A hollow, aching void. The last of your hardtack, a dense, unyielding biscuit, was consumed days ago. Tried foraging, remembering fragmented advice about edible roots and berries, but your knowledge is limited. The risk of poisoning is ever present. You recall seeing a fellow pilgrim, a young man from Flanders named Peter. The desperately chewing on a bitter-tasting plant, his face contorted in disgust. "It's better than nothing," he choked out, welling in his eyes, "but it feels like swallowing bile." He hadn't survived the next week. The silence around you is broken only by the distant cry of a bird of prey, a sound that offers no comfort. Stark reminder of the predatory nature of this wilderness. You strain your ears, hoping for the faint jingle of harness, shout of a fellow soldier, but there is only the wind, a mournful, ceaseless sigh. As the seasons change, the toll of being lost becomes as debilitating as the physical hardship. Fear, a constant companion to warp your perception. Every shadow seems to harbor a threat, every rustle of leaves a lurking enemy. You start to question your own sanity, your memories becoming hazy, your sense of time dissolving. You remember a conversation with a seasoned crusader, a man known only as the Bear, who had been captured and escaped from Saracen hands during the First Crusade. His eyes, faded denim, held a chilling emptiness as he recounted his ordeal. "When I was alone after they left me for dead," he'd rumbled, low and gravelly. "The silence was the worst. It wasn't empty silence. It was full of whispers, voices of my family, my comrades, even the voices of the men I'd killed. They'd call my name, taunting me, telling me I was forgotten, that God had abandoned me. Faces in the rocks, in the trees. I'd fight them, you see, fight the phantoms. It kept me alive, I think, drove me madder. You can almost feel the phantom touch on your arm, the chilling whisper in your ear. Wooden cross around your neck, its familiar shape a small anchor in the surging tide of your fear. Your male hauberk, once a symbol of protection, now feels like an unbearable burden, a constant reminder of your vulnerability. Finally breaking through the haze, offers a brief, blinding glare, making your already parched eyes water. You squint, horizon, a desperate hope flickering within you, a plume of smoke, a distant caravan, or just another cruel trick of the light. As the seasons change, the stark reality of the Crusades' logistical nightmares becomes undeniably clear. About valiant knights charging into battle, it's about ordinary people facing unimaginable hardship, tested at every turn by the sheer, brutal indifference of the world. The lack of reliable intelligence, of consistent supply lines, and the unforgiving nature of the landscape combine to create a perfect storm of suffering. Almost feel the gnawing hunger, the debilitating thirst, the gnawing fear that accompanied every step of these epic journeys. You recall reading in a recovered monastic chronicle dating from around 1100 AD, detailing the arduous march of the first Crusaders through Anatolia. It spoke of men resorting to eating their own horses, then their dogs, and even in the most desperate of circumstances, their fallen comrades. The chronicle described the sheer exhaustion, the way the men's minds, starved of sustenance and hope, began to unravel. It was a testament to the raw, unvarnished truth of their struggle, a truth often glossed over in the grand narratives of holy war. You can feel the rough texture of the earth beneath your hands as you try to steady yourself, the dry heat radiating upwards. Tang of blood from a recent scrape on your knee mixes with the dusty air. You can almost hear the faint, distant sound of hoofbeats, a sound that sends a jolt of adrenaline through you, a desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, is at hand. But as the sound fades, replaced once more by the omnipresent silence, with the chilling understanding that in this vast, unforgiving wilderness, you are truly on your own. Truth of why traveling, in the context of these holy wars, was a terrifying ordeal into a world where survival was a daily, desperate gamble. the harsh realities of navigation, and the terrifying vulnerability of being lost in these unforgiving territories continue to weigh heavily on your consciousness. As you sit here in the relative comfort of your present, imagine the sheer, adulterated terror of knowing that your very survival depends on finding a path through an alien landscape with no guarantee of water or safety. This profound sense of isolation, this primal fear, is a crucial element in understanding the true cost of the Crusades. Cost measured not just in battles fought, but in the silent, agonizing struggles waged against the very earth itself. The memory of the desert sun, the biting wind, the endless, featureless plains, these sensations linger. Challenges faced by those who dared to venture so far from home, driven by faith, ambition, or sheer desperation. As the light outside your window begins to soften, signaling the approach of evening, feel the chill of a desert night descending, the stars once again appearing, witnesses to the enduring human struggle for survival. But before we let the darkness fully envelop us, let us consider the sounds that might break that silence, the subtle shifts in the environment that could offer a glimmer of hope or a renewed sense of dread. As darkness settles around you now, darkness that meant something completely different. Not the comforting absence of light in your cozy room, but a vast, suffocating blackness that swallowed ships whole, a darkness punctuated only by the furious roar of wind and the splintering cry of wood, darkness of the open sea, a realm far more capricious and unforgiving than any land-based peril the wary Crusaders had faced. Understanding deepens. We've journeyed through the ravages of disease and the bite of inclement weather on land. Now, we turn our gaze to the vast, shimmering expanse of the Mediterranean and beyond, a watery highway that promised a swift route to the Holy Land, but often delivered only terror and despair. Embarked upon these voyages, the perils of the sea were not abstract threats, they were immediate, visceral, and often fatal. Turn to days as we delve into the maritime nightmares of the Crusades, fantasized images of gleaming galleys and triumphant arrivals. The reality was far grimmer. Ships of the era, impressive for their time, were fragile entities vulnerable to the whims of nature. Imagine being crammed into the belly of a vessel with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale rations, and the ever-present fear of seasickness. The deck above, your only connection to the sky and the elements, would be a chaotic, pitching mess of ropes, sails, and panicked men. The most immediate and devastating threat. You might set sail under a clear sky, the sun glinting off the gentle waves, caught hours later in a tempest that churned the sea into a frothing, monstrous entity. The ships, masted cogs or larger galleys propelled by both sail and oar, were ill-equipped to handle gale, force winds and towering waves. Sails would rip, masts would snap like twigs, and the hull itself could be breached by the relentless assault of the sea. Discovered in archives detailing the Third Crusade, accounts of ships being tossed about like toys, the water pouring in over the sides, drag everything down into the crushing depths. The shrieks of drowning men, the desperate prayers, sheer terror of realizing that your fate was entirely in the hands of an indifferent ocean. These were the sounds and emotions that defined a storm at sea. Navigation was a testament to human courage and a desperate reliance on limited knowledge. Sextants or accurate chronometers, sailors relied on celestial navigation, observing the stars and the sun. But what happened when the sky was overcast for days on end, or when a storm obscured the very heavens they depended upon? Was a terrifyingly common occurrence. Imagine drifting aimlessly, your water stores dwindling, food supplies becoming rancid, the hope of reaching your destination fading with each passing, sunless day. The fear of starvation and dehydration, coupled with the gnawing uncertainty of your location, was a slow, agonizing torment. From a bishop on the Second Crusade, lamenting their inability to ascertain their position for nearly a fortnight, growing mutinous and despairing. This wasn't just a matter of inconvenience, it was a matter of life and death, a frequent and brutal consequence of these maritime challenges. When a ship met its end, it was rarely a clean break. The timbers would groan and splinter, the cargo would be flung about, and the men aboard would be thrown into the churning water. Survivors would cling to any floating debris, their bodies battered, their lungs burning, reaching the Holy Land replaced by a desperate struggle for mere survival. The cold embrace of the sea, the exhaustion, and the sheer impossibility of swimming for days on end meant that most who went overboard did not return. The Mediterranean, tinted as a placid blue, could transform into a watery grave with terrifying speed. Weren't solely the wrath of nature. The waters, even in this era of religious fervor, entirely devoid of human predators. Piracy was a persistent threat. Imagine the anxiety of spotting a sail on the horizon, a beacon of hope, only to realize it was a vessel with ill intent. These pirate ships, and more maneuverable than the Crusader vessels, would attack with a ferocity born of desperation and greed. The Crusaders, burdened by their armor and their heavy weaponry, were often ill-prepared for swift close-quarters combat at sea. Of a pirate raid could be even more horrific than a shipwreck. Captured Crusaders faced enslavement, ransom, or a brutal death. The spoils of war, which were meant to be the treasures of the Holy Land, instead be the very possessions they carried for their journey, leaving them utterly destitute and vulnerable. Let's focus on a specific moment. Imagine you are Brother Thomas, a humble monk accompanying Louis IX on the Seventh Crusade in 1249. You are aboard a troop transport, a sturdy but crowded vessel named the Pilgrim's Hopi. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, garlic, and metallic tang of fear. You're sharing your cramped space with a dozen other men, their armor clanking softly as they shift. Sea is calm today, a deceptive mirror reflecting the brilliant azure sky. A seasoned sailor, named Silas, with eyes like chips of flint, is at the helm. The wind is fair, father. Silas grunts and sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. We should make Cyprus by sunset, God willing. You nod, the wooden crucifix around your neck. God willing indeed, Silas, these waters can be treacherous. Suddenly, a cry from the crow's nest pierces the relative calm. Sail ho! Starboard bow! All eyes snap towards the horizon. A ship, its sails dark against the bright sky, is closing in rapidly. It's not a familiar banner. Silas's face hardens. Pirates. He spits, low and grim. May the saints preserve us. Panic ripples through the crowded deck. Men scramble for their weapons. Clumsy in the confined space, you, with no armor to weigh you down, find yourself pushed against the railing, spray hitting your face. You can feel the vibration of the ship as it alters course, attempting to outrun the attacker. Is faster, its sails full, its crew a blur of desperate motion. You can almost hear their raucous shouts carried on the wind, a chilling prelude to the violence to come. Your hands shake as you grip the railing, the rough wood a small comfort against the churning fear in your gut. The glorious pilgrimage you envisioned, this is a stark, terrifying reality. The stark reality of sea travel during the Crusades was a brutal counterpoint to the lofty religious ideals. A world of constant uncertainty, where the elements and human avarice conspired to make every voyage a gamble. The sheer logistical nightmare of transporting thousands of men, horses, and supplies across vast distances by sea was immense. At any point, could have catastrophic consequences for the entire endeavor. The sea, in its vastness and power, was a formidable adversary, one that often proved more destructive than any enemy army. Your mind drifts back to the quiet of your room, of your breathing. The storm at sea has subsided, leaving behind a lingering sense of unease, taste of salt and fear. But the journey is far from over. As the dawn light begins to creep into the edges of your vision, remember that the challenges on land, though formidable, were often only the beginning of the ordeal for these determined and often doomed. The next leg of our historical journey will explore the arduous and often brutal nature of overland travel, suffering, but equally devastating. Imagine waking up in an era where your biggest worry wasn't Wi-Fi connectivity, of steel in the pre-dawn gloom, the air thick with the damp chill of the Anatolian plateau in late autumn, the earthy scent of dew-kissed soil and distant pine, but also a low, guttural murmur that prickles the hairs on the back of your neck. You're nestled, if you can call it that, in a makeshift camp. Woolen blankets and patched tunics strewn around a dying ember of a fire. Canvas of your tent offers little solace, a fragile barrier against the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounds you. Of leaves, every snap of a twig is amplified tenfold. In your anxious mind into the stealthy tread of approaching danger. This isn't the romanticized notion of chivalry. This is the raw, visceral fear of being utterly vulnerable, of being a prize waiting to be claimed. The very land you traverse, ring glimpses of breathtaking, untamed beauty, also teems with opportunistic predators, both human and, as you've learned, the whispers you've heard in hushed tones around flickering campfires speak of villages turned to ash, stripped bare and left to the elements, of the ever-present threat of men who have no king, no creed, for what you carry, be it coin provisions, need to assert their own brutal dominion over a world that has offered them little else. Your hands, calloused from days of marching and the occasional futile attempt at foraging, slightly as you reach for the worn leather pouch containing your meager savings, becomes familiar as the gnawing dread becomes a constant companion. Each day's march is a calculated risk with potential disaster. You've learned to scan the horizon with a hawk's intensity, not for landmarks to guide you, but for signs of trouble. A plume of smoke where no fire should be, a sudden scattering of birds from a wooded ridge, stillness of a landscape that should be alive with the chirping of insects or the bleating of distant sheep. These are the new cartography of survival. Moving from point A to point B, you are navigating a minefield of human rapacity. The local populations, displaced by the very armies marching through their lands, or simply existing on the fringes of any semblance of law, become adept at exploiting any weakness. They are not always outright bandits. Between desperation and predatory intent is thin and easily blurred. You've seen it in their eyes as you pass through their hamlets, a mixture of suspicion, resentment, assessment of your vulnerability. Consider the encounter near the town of Iconium, or modern-day Konya, summer of 1190, during the Third Crusade. Richard the Lionheart's army, while a formidable force, immune to these insidious threats, a detachment scouting for provisions, found itself ambushed not by a grand army, band of local brigands who knew the treacherous mountain passes intimately. They moved with a fluidity born of desperation, peering from the very rocks and scrub brush, their crude weapons surprisingly effective against lightly armored soldiers caught off guard. and the skirmish was brutal and swift, leaving several men dead and precious supplies lost. The survivors, their faces grim and streaked with grime and blood, returned with a grim testament to the fact that even a king's army was not invulnerable. A humble pilgrim or a foot soldier would have been an even easier target. The rustle of your woolen cloak, the clinking of your meager possessions would have been a beacon to those who preyed on the weak. The conversations around the campfire, to speak of such things, were laced with a chilling pragmatism. Old Thomas, veteran whose face was a roadmap of past hardships, once recounted an experience from an earlier expedition, marching through what looked like peaceful hills. He'd rasped, his voice rough as sandpaper, when suddenly, from the trees, soldiers, mind you, but men dressed in skins, their faces painted, they didn't shout battle cries, they screamed like animals, took our horses, our food, and worse, left us with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the fear in our souls. Never trust a quiet path. He'd spat into the dying embers, his eyes reflecting a deep, abiding weariness. Another pilgrim, a young man named Joffre, of his teens, and still clutching a tarnished silver crucifix as if it were a shield, his entire saddlebag to a swift snatch and grab by a pair of swift-footed youths as he paused to drink from a stream. Pale, his voice trembling, as he described the incident, they were like shadows, he whispered, barely audible above the crackling fire. One moment I was looking at the water, the next gone. Everything. My spare boots, the bread my mother packed, even the small wooden bird I carved for my sister. It's not just the coin they want makes us ECs. The loss, though material, was a profound violation, stark reminder of how easily your very identity could be stripped away. This constant threat wasn't limited to the open road. Perceived safety of settlements, be they fortified towns or temporary encampments, vigilance was paramount. Robberies were common, and if you were unfortunate enough to be the victim of a more serious crime, justice was a distant, unattainable concept. The Byzantine Empire, for all its supposed order, was a labyrinth of shifting allegiances and local strongmen who often operated with impunity, easily find themselves caught between competing factions, their possessions confiscated by one group, targeted by another seeking to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. You learn to sleep with one eye open, never too far from whatever meager weapon you possess, a sturdy walking stick, perhaps a sharpened dagger if you were particularly well equipped. The darkness, which we've explored as a source of primal fear, cloak for human predators, their movements silent and deadly. It's a stark contrast to the modern-day inconvenience of a delayed flight. This is about the fundamental struggle for survival. Greatest danger often comes not from the elements, but from your fellow man. I discovered in archives detailing the logistical nightmares of the Third Crusade that provisioning armies was a constant challenge, not just due to scarcity, but precisely because of the pervasive banditry that made the transport of goods a perilous undertaking, requiring armed escorts that further strained already limited resources. The sheer exhaustion that such constant vigilance imposed was bone deep. Sleep offered little true respite, haunted by the very fears that plagued your waking hours. You'd wake with a jolt, hammering against your ribs, convinced you'd heard footsteps outside your tent, only to find the quiet moon hanging in the sky. The smell of damp earth and the distant, mournful cry of an owl would fill your senses, a stark reminder of your isolation. This was the reality of travel in the era of the Crusades for the common person, a relentless existence where the spectre of violence was as pervasive as the dust on your worn boots. testament to why such journeys were undertaken only out of the most profound conviction or the most desperate necessity. As the chill of the night deepens, and you pull your threadbare cloak tighter, but wonder what new dangers the approaching dawn will bring, perhaps even from those who claim to be on the same sacred path. As you settle in tonight, let me transport you to a world both alien and achingly familiar, a world where the grand pronouncements of faith often mask the grimy, brutal reality of human nature. We've journeyed through the treacherous seas and the wary, hostile lands, the gnawing hunger and the chilling fear of the unknown. But tonight, we turn our gaze inward, the Crusader armies, to uncover a truth far more insidious than any external enemy. The danger, my friend, and the deserts, or the glint of a Saracen's scimitar, it was in the shadowed tents, the whispered arguments, the glint of envy in a fellow pilgrim's eye. Prepare yourself. Threat to these holy warriors often came from within their own ranks. With each passing moment, image of unified, God-fearing soldiers begins to fray. Imagine the vast encampments, temporary cities under the unforgiving sun, the air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale bread, present odor of animal dung, hummed with a cacophony of sounds, the clang of metal on metal as armor was mended, prayers, the sharp crack of a whip, and the drunken shouts that punctuated the long, weary nights. A monastic retreat. It was a chaotic, desperate undertaking filled with men from every strata of European society, and each carrying their own burdens, their own ambitions, and their own resentments. The early Crusades, Crusade de 1096-1099, were a testament to this internal fracturing. While the initial fervor to reclaim Jerusalem was powerful, it was also a magnet for individuals with less than holy motivations. You see, land, wealth, and spiritual salvation was a potent brew, attracting not just devout knights, but also opportunistic barons, disaffected peasants, and even outright brigands. These were not always men who shared a common vision. They were men who saw an opportunity. Consider the logistics of such a vast undertaking. Provisions were scarce, and the distribution was often uneven. Powerful lords, retinues of knights and servants, would secure the best of what little was available, leaving the common foot soldiers, pauperest of the poor, to scrounge and starve. This created a simmering resentment, a palpable tension that crackled beneath the surface of any shared meal or communal prayer. You might witness a gruff Flemish peasant, his face etched with hunger, watching with bitter envy as a Norman baron's squire carved a plump fowl, wafting through the dusty air. The leadership itself was a constant source of friction. Like Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond IV of Toulouse were respected, the sheer diversity of backgrounds and loyalties meant that consensus was a rare commodity. Decisions were often debated endlessly, rivalries and regional animosities. I recall reading accounts from the siege of Antioch on 1097 on 1098, moment where starvation stalked the Crusader camp. Disagreements over strategy, whether to press the siege or to retreat, nearly tore the army apart. Some argued for immediate action, their stomachs gnawing at their resolve. Others, perhaps more pragmatic or more fearful, advocated for caution. With each passing moment, betrayal was sound. Imagine a scene in a dimly lit tent, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows. Two men, once comrades in arms, now sit across from each other, the air thick with unspoken accusations. One, a minor knight named Sir Calen, stained with sweat and grime, leans forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Promised me a share of the spoils from that raid on the village near Nicaea, Guilam, he says, drumming impatiently on the rough, hewn table. And yet, I received naught but a dented helm and a mouthful of dust. Gwilym, a man with a more polished bearing, his eyes held a similar wariness, shrugs dismissively. The spoils were less than anticipated, Kylan, and the distribution was overseen by Count Bordwin himself. What could I do? His tone is smooth, perceptible tightening of his jaw betrays his unease. You could have spoken up, Kylan retorts, his voice rising slightly. You could have remembered that we swore oaths, not just to our lords, but to each other. Whole journey, it's turning men into beasts, Gwilym. Some beasts are more cunning than others. He gestures vaguely towards the flap of the tent. Sounds of revelry and argument can be heard. I saw you speaking with Sir Reginald's men earlier. What was that about? Gwilym shifts, his gaze flickering. Merely discussing the defences. He avoids Kylan's direct stare. The truth, perhaps, Gwilym had been offered a more lucrative position by Reginald, a man known for his ruthless pragmatism, for certain indiscretions. Information about troop movements, or perhaps the location of vital supplies, personal gain even at the expense of fellow pilgrims, was a powerful temptation in this desperate environment, not an isolated incident. Central authority and the breakdown of established social order created a vacuum filled by self-interest. Food and water, essential for survival, became bargaining chips. Horses vital for mobility and combat were hoarded. Even news from home, rumors of the enemy's movements, could be traded for a few precious coins or a promise of future favor. Archives that during the arduous march through Anatolia after the victory at Dorylaeum in 1097, soldiers were known to steal from their comrades' meager possessions, to violence over a stolen loaf of bread or a water skin. The psychological toll was immense. The gnawing fear not just of the enemy, but of the man sleeping next to you. The constant suspicion eroded trust, potentially unified force into a collection of wary individuals. The spiritual purpose of the expedition, sacred quest to Jerusalem, often became secondary to the immediate struggle for survival, and the pursuit of personal advantage that bound them together was tested, twisted, and sometimes broken by the harsh realities of their journey. That the sweet scent in a chapel was a distant memory, replaced by the acrid smell of fear and betrayal in the crowded. With each passing moment, the cumulative effect of these internal conflicts weakened the Crusader armies. While they would eventually achieve their objective of capturing Jerusalem in 1099, was far greater than the battles fought against the Seljuk Turks. The scars of internal strife, the betrayals and the mistrust, festering and contributing to the instability of the newly formed Crusader states, a stark reminder that even the most noble of causes can be undermined by the darker aspects of human nature. Sun sets on this particular encampment, casting long shadows that hide as much as they reveal. You can't help but wonder about the next sunrise, and who might be looking at you with hunger in their eyes, not for food, for something you possess. The journey ahead, though seemingly clearer now that Jerusalem is within reach, is still fraught with dangers, seen and unseen. And the greatest of these, as we've seen, often wear the same pilgrim's cloak as you. History settles gently on your shoulders as our story begins. You've witnessed the brutal realities of the journey. Hunger, the relentless physical exertion, the ever-present threat of violence from without. But the Crusades, as you're coming to understand, were not merely a test of physical endurance, or a profound assault on the very fabric of the human psyche. The constant fear, the gnawing dread of the unknown. These elements conspired to unravel the minds of even the most resolute. the sun beating down on your exposed skin, not with the gentle warmth of a summer afternoon, but with a searing, relentless intensity that promised only further dehydration and despair. The air, dust of countless marching feet, and the acrid scent of unwashed bodies offered no respite, suffocating embrace that mirrored the tightening grip of anxiety around your heart. Your perspective shifts when you consider the mental erosion that accompanied this physical torment. The initial fervor, the righteous conviction that fueled the early stages of the journey, began to fray like worn tapestry. Each lost comrade, skirmish, each glimpse of a mangled corpse left an indelible scar on your soul. You remember Brother Thomas' unwavering faith, whose eyes, once bright with divine purpose, now held a vacant, haunted stare, whisper prayers to himself, not with devotion, but with a desperate, almost frantic cadence, as if trying to ward off unseen demons that clawed at the edges of his sanity. The camp at night were no longer the comforting murmur of fellowship, but a cacophony of groans, feverish muttering, occasional piercing scream that spoke of nightmares far more terrifying than any waking reality. You recall a particular evening, the air heavy with the lingering stench of dysentery and decay, as you sat by a sputtering campfire, sharing a meager ration of hardtack with Sir Kylan. His usually stern countenance was slack, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I saw my wife's face in the smoke tonight sleeping," he confessed, his voice a raspy whisper. "She was smiling. We first met in the gardens of Acre. Then the smoke turned black. Her smile twisted into a rictus of agony." He shuddered, pulling his worn wool cloak tighter around his shoulders, texture offering little comfort against the chill that seeped from within. "This journey," he continued, barely audible above the crackling fire, "it strips away everything. It leaves you hollowed out, filled with fear and regret." The memory of his words, delivered with such raw vulnerability, still sends a tremor through you. Before, but never, had the despair been so palpable, so all-consuming. Perspective shifts when you delve into the psychological impact of witnessing such profound suffering and loss firsthand. Exposure to death, disease, and the sheer brutality of the conflict desensitized some, turning them into hardened, unfeeling automatons. For others, it was a descent into madness. You remember a young squire, barely a man, with the birds. At first, it was seen as a harmless eccentricity, a coping mechanism. But soon, he was convinced they were delivering divine messages, urging him to perform acts of violence against his own companions. They were heathens in disguise. His cries, filled with a chilling blend of terror and conviction, echoed through the camp, testament to the fragility of the human mind under immense pressure. Historical accounts from the period, such as those found in the Chronicles of William of Tyre, often allude to the psychological strain on soldiers, instances of melancholy and despair that incapacitated even the most robust individuals. In the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, a letter from a participant in the Third Crusade, how the constant fear of ambush and the sight of gruesome battlefield wounds led many to question their faith and their very purpose. Road to Jerusalem is paved with the broken spirits of men, as much as with the bones of the fallen. Your perspective shifts when you consider the impact of betrayal and the erosion of trust. Initial camaraderie forged in shared hardship began to crumble under the weight of suspicion and self-preservation. You've seen men, once brothers, turn on each other over meager supplies, whispered accusations of cowardice or perceived slights. Goal of recapturing the Holy Land seemed to fade into the background. Desperate struggle for survival against both external enemies. and internal discord. You recall a tense negotiation with a local chieftain, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. He offered provisions, a seemingly benevolent gesture, but the air in his tent was thick with the scent of exotic spices and something else, a hint of poison. Your leader, a grizzled veteran named Lord Reginald, felt it too. You remember their hushed conversation, the tension palpable. Lord Reginald, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, said, "His words are sweet, but his eyes speak of treachery. We cannot afford to be weakened by misplaced trust. Not now." The chieftain chauffeured a small, intricately carved wooden bird. A token of goodwill, he purred, lingering on Lord Reginald's hand. Lord Reginald accepted it with a curt nod, saw him toss it into the dying embers of the fire later that night, the wood hissing and cracking as it burned. This constant vigilance, this perpetual state of suspicion was an exhausting burden, adding another layer to the psychological torment. It's akin to how, in our modern world, the constant barrage of information and the subtle manipulations of social media can create a pervasive sense of unease and distrust. Stakes in the Crusades were, of course, infinitely higher. Perspective shifts when you understand how the sheer monotony of the journey, punctuated by moments of sheer terror, one's perception of time and reality, days blurred into weeks and weeks into months. The landscape, though varied, offered little solace. The endless expanse of arid plains, the oppressive density of unfamiliar forests, whipped across desolate mountains, all contributed to a growing sense of insignificance and hopelessness. Particularly bleak stretch through the Anatolian plateau in 1097. The heat was relentless, the water scarce. Seljuk forces harried them relentlessly. The men's spirits were at their lowest ebb. Food was scarce. Rations of grain, often infested with weevils, did little to sustain them. The taste was earthy and bitter, reminder of their dwindling resources. The sounds were the shuffling of weary feet, the whinnying of exhausted horses, cries of the wounded. You recall overhearing a conversation between two soldiers, hoarse from thirst and despair. "Do you think we will ever see our homes again, Thomas?" one asked. The other, face gaunt and etched with lines of suffering, simply shook his head. "I think," he rasped, "that home is now just a memory we chase on a road that seems to have no end." This existential dread, the gnawing fear that the entire endeavor was futile, sacrifices were in vain, was perhaps the most insidious psychological weapon of the Crusades. It chipped away at their resolve, vulnerable to despair and disillusionment. Your perspective shifts when you realize that the very act of traveling, the constant movement and displacement, contributed to a profound sense of alienation. You were far from home, from familiar faces, routines of daily life, even when encounters with local populations occurred, fraught with suspicion and hostility, as we've touched upon. The language barriers, the cultural differences, the sheer foreignness of everything around you, it all served to isolate you. You feel like an outsider in every land you traversed. Colors of the silks traded in bustling bazaars were a stark contrast to the drab, mud-stained wool and leather of your own attire, of roasting meats and exotic spices wafted from food stalls, but often unattainable luxury compared to your own meager rations. The sounds of unfamiliar music and boisterous laughter from taverns only amplified your sense of being adrift. You remember a moment of profound homesickness while passing through a small Byzantine town. The sight of a woman tending her small garden, gentle and familiar, brought a pang to your chest so sharp it stole your breath. You saw her call out to a child playing nearby, warm and loving, and for a fleeting moment, you were transported back to your own village, to the laughter of your own kin. The stark contrast between that vision and your current reality was almost unbearable. This constant yearning for what was lost, with the grim determination to press on, created a deep internal conflict that wore down the spirit. Psychological toll of the Crusades was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing erosion, fractured minds and broken souls. As we prepare to move on, remember that the physical journey was merely the prelude to a far more devastating internal conflict, stepping through time into a world that operated by entirely different rules. Act of movement across vast distances was an undertaking fraught with peril, a testament to human endurance and often a slope into despair. You've journeyed with us through the initial fervor, the hopeful beginnings of these grand expeditions. Sun beats down relentlessly as the dust coats everything you own. And as the gnawing emptiness in your belly becomes a constant companion, you understand the true cost. This isn't a romantic ballad, brutal chronicle of suffering. The initial zeal has long since evaporated, replaced by a grim pragmatism, desperate clinging to life as the Holy Land, or whatever distant objective, feels impossibly far away. The vibrant colors of your home, the familiar scent of wood smoke and damp earth are fading memories, replaced by the bleached, arid plains and the acrid tang of sweat and decay. Hours turn to days as the relentless march continues. Your boots, sturdy leather, are now cracked and worn, the soles flapping with each agonizing step. The weight of your pack, laden with meager provisions, the few precious possessions you could carry, and the ever-present armor strapped to your back. You can feel the chafing of the rough wool against your skin, a constant of your body's protest. The sun, a malevolent eye in a pale sky, bakes the earth. Some shimmer heat waves that distort the horizon and play tricks on your wary mind. You squint, discern shapes in the wavering air, hoping for the sight of water, of shade, of anything that promises respite. Is thick, heavy, tasting of dust and the faint metallic scent of dried blood from a recent skirmish or a foraging accident. Are the promises made back home's streets paved with gold, the glory of reclaiming sacred sites, favor that would surely attend such a righteous endeavor. But the reality is a landscape of cracked earth, thorny scrub, remains of unfortunate animals, picked clean by scavengers. The water skins, once full and cool, are now limp and warm, precious liquid within tasting faintly of leather and desperation. Each sip is measured, risk against the gnawing thirst that never truly leaves. You see it in the eyes of your companions. Too, the hollowed cheeks, the sunken gazes, the way they shuffle rather than walk, their spirits as depleted as their physical reserves. That once buoyed spirits is now a fragile thing, easily shattered by a harsh word or a perceived slight. Exhaustion and hunger. You hear the low murmur of prayers, not of fervent supplication, but of weary resignation, strength to endure another hour, another mile. The clang of armor is muted now, a hollow sound that speaks of rust and disrepair rather than martial prowess. You can smell the unwashed bodies, the festering wounds that refuse to heal in this unforgiving environment, the faint, sickly sweet odor of dysentery that clings to the camp like a shroud. You recall the stories of the great battles, the triumphant charges. Reality is a slow, agonizing crawl, a test of sheer will against an indifferent world. Find yourself huddled with a few others around a meager fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on your gaunt faces. Brother Thomas, Once spoke with booming conviction of God's wrath, now whispers of his family back in Paris, his voice raspy. I never imagined, he croaks, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. The path to salvation would be paved with such emptiness. He gestures vaguely with a trembling hand, his fingernails caked with dirt. My tunic, he continues, his voice barely audible, it's eaten with moths. And my boots, I fear they will crumble to dust before we reach Antioch. Beside him, a younger man, a simple farmer named Guillaume. Ownership in the east have long since faded, stares blankly into the fire. He's been coughing for days, a dry sound that rattles his frail frame. The bread, he mutters, his voice a reedy whisper. That's gone, all of it. Meat, it tastes like bile. He tries to swallow, but his throat is too dry. He reaches for a water skin, but it's empty. Of despair washes over him, visible in the slump of his shoulders. Then there's Sir Kalen, a seasoned warrior whose armor, scarred, still gleams faintly in the firelight. He's usually the stoic one, the one who rallies the men. But tonight, his gaze distant. We lost another mare today, he says, his voice rough. Fell into a ravine. Saw her go. Just gone. Like so many others, he clenches his fist, the knuckles white. The provisions are so low. Acorns. Acorns, by the holy sepulchre! He spits onto the ground, a gesture of pure frustration. Saw a man gnawing on his own leather belt yesterday, and gnawing on it like a dog. You recall a passage from a salvaged chronicle. Who accompanied the Second Crusade in 1147? He described the journey through Anatolia as a walking death. He wrote of men so weak they could barely lift their swords, soldiers resorting to eating roots and bark, entire detachments succumbing to starvation and disease before ever reaching their destination. In the archives of a small monastic library, a faded letter from a German pilgrim dating back to 1096. If his entire family took fever and thirst on the road to Constantinople. His words are stark testament to the fragility of life on such journeys. Sheer logistics of feeding and supplying an army of tens of thousands across hundreds, even thousands of miles. Infrastructure, no reliable supply lines, was a monumental, often insurmountable challenge. Trying to power a smartphone with a single flickering candle. The air grows colder as the night deepens, chill that offers no relief from the day's heat, but rather a gnawing dampness that seeps into your bones. You pull your thin cloak tighter, the rough wool scratching at your exposed neck. The sounds of the camp are subdued, the occasional cough of restless sleep, the distant howl of a jackal, a lonely sound that echoes the emptiness in your own soul. You close your eyes. Sleep offers little escape. Your dreams are filled with images of lush fields, overflowing tables, and cool, clear water, to the harsh reality of your surroundings. The journey is not just a physical ordeal, it's a relentless assault on the mind, at hope, at sanity, at the very essence of what it means to be human. This is the crucible, the true test. Will of faith is forged or broken against the anvil of an unforgiving world. And as you drift towards a fitful sleep, tomorrow will bring more of the same, a continuation of this agonizing pilgrimage, a desperate hope that the end, maybe, is finally within reach. But the path ahead remains shrouded in uncertainty, a testament to the sheer of traversing the world in an age when even the shortest journey was an act of profound courage, or perhaps profound folly. A home of safety, of comfort, becomes a distant, almost mythical land. Stark contrast to the harsh reality of your present existence, a stark reminder of why traveling sucked in the Crusades. archaeological evidence tells us stories that Hollywood never bothered to explore. It whispers of shattered dreams to the elements of the sheer, unvarnished terror that accompanied any significant journey in the pre-modern world. Glorious banners unfurling or valiant knights charging. This is about the stench of despair, the gnawing hunger, the gnawing doubt that gnawed at the very souls of those who dared to venture far from their familiar hearths, about to witness the grim culmination of such a venture to the brutal reality that lay beneath the gilded veneer of pilgrimage and conquest. Understand the crushing weight of anticipation that must have settled upon the weary travelers as they finally sight their destination. But this isn't the triumphant arrival sung about in epic ballads. Imagine, if you will, the year is 1147, part of the Second Crusade, a vast undertaking that promised spiritual salvation and earthly glory. Yet the reality has been a slow, agonizing descent into hell. Your journey began with tens of thousands, a vibrant tapestry of men, women, and children filled with fervent belief and perhaps a touch of avarice. Now, as the battered ramparts of Antioch loom on the horizon, a hazy, mirage-like vision against the relentless sun, your numbers are a fraction of what they once were. The air, with the clang of armor and the hopeful hymns, is now thick with the rasping coughs of the sick and the hollow moans of the dying. You can taste the dust on your tongue, a gritty reminder of the parched earth you've traversed, and the metallic tang of dried blood from countless unseen skirmishes and desperate fights for meager rations. Your tunic, once a sturdy wool, is now a tattered, clinging uncomfortably to your emaciated frame. The leather of your boots is cracked and stiff, offering little protection against the sharp stones that litter the path. The smell of unwashed bodies, festering wounds, present stench of decay hangs heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket that amplifies your own fatigue. In your bones, a deep, persistent throb that seems to echo the very rhythm of your faltering steps. Gleaming shield strapped to your back is dented and scarred, a testament to the brutal encounters you've survived, merely endured. You stagger forward, your vision blurring at the edges. Beside you, new as a robust farmer from your home village, a man named Thomas collapses onto the dusty ground. His face, etched with a pain that no amount of prayer can alleviate, turns towards you. His eyes, once bright with the promise of a new life, sunken and clouded with despair. "Brother," he rasps, his voice barely a whisper. I cannot go further. The fever, it burns me from within." You kneel beside him, your own strength failing, but a flicker of shared humanity compels you to offer what little comfort you can. You reach out, hand trembling as you touch his forehead. It is burning hot, a testament to the pervasive fevers that have claimed so many. You say, your voice rough with exhaustion, "Hold on, we are so close. Antioch awaits." He manages a weak, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Salvation, is it worth this, brother?" This slow dying, his gaze drifts to the skeletal remains of a horse lying by the roadside, starkly visible against the bleached earth. Even the carrion birds seem to have abandoned it, testament to the sheer desolation. You can feel the familiar prickle of tears, quickly suppressed. You've seen too much death to afford such luxury. You remember the joyous send-off, the blessings from the priests, the promises of divine favor. Now, the only divine favor you feel is the continued beat of your own heart, however weak. To stand, your muscles screaming in protest. You can hear the faint, mocking cries of circling vultures, a constant reminder of the fragility of life on this arduous journey. The meager supplies you carried are long gone. an insatiable hunger that gnaws at your gut. The water you managed to find in stagnant pools tasted foul, grunting, but laced with the impurities that have sound disease throughout your ranks. Another figure stumbles towards you, a woman named Agnes. Her normally rosy cheeks now pale and drawn. She clutches a small, crudely carved wooden cross, her knuckles white. "You seen my child?" she asks, her voice laced with a frantic edge. "Ilara, she wandered off near the riverbed this morning." Your heart sinks. You saw a small, blue ribbon snagged on a thorny bush near the river. You didn't want to alarm her then, but now, Agnes. You begin, soft. I think I saw something near the water." You can't bring yourself to say more. The truth is too brutal. Lets out a guttural sob, dropping the cross. It lands with a soft thud in the dust, unnoticed. She collapses to her knees with grief. You can smell the faint, sweet scent of dried wildflowers she must have gathered for her daughter. Poignant reminder of what has been lost. The sheer scale of suffering is overwhelming. It's not just the physical toll, the starvation, the disease, constant exposure to the elements. It's the psychological devastation that fueled this journey has been systematically stripped away, leaving behind a raw, exposed core of despair. A passage from a monastic chronicle I unearthed in the archives of Durham Cathedral, dating from around this period. It spoke of a contingent of pilgrims that arrived at a certain point in their journey, so depleted that they were barely recognizable as the proud company that had set out. The chronicler described their appearance as like spectres of death, their bodies gaunt, their eyes hollow, their spirits broken deeply with what you are witnessing, what you are feeling. Stark contrast to the triumphant images often portrayed in illuminated manuscripts. Pilgrims are depicted as hale and hearty, their faith unwavering. You can feel the sun beating down on your bare scalp, punishing heat. The air shimmers with heat haze, distorting the already bleak landscape. The distant city walls, beacon of hope, now seem like the gates of a tomb. You can hear the faint, persistent buzzing of flies, the sickly, sweet smell of decay. The ground beneath your feet is hard, packed earth littered with the detritus of a broken company. Scraps of cloth, broken tools, the occasional glint of a lost coin that no one has the strength to retrieve. You understand now, with chilling clarity, the true cost of this endeavor. The victory, if it can even be called that, is Pyrrhic. You have reached your destination, yes, but at a price that defies comprehension. The men and women who stand with you are not the vibrant pilgrims who set out. They are the broken remnants haunted by the ghosts of those they have lost, tested to its absolute limit. The journey itself has been the true conqueror, a brutal force that has stripped away everything but the most primal instinct for survival. As the shadows begin to lengthen, casting long, distorted shapes across the desolate plain, you know that the trials are far from over. The arrival is not an end, but merely a pause before the next act of this grim drama. You can feel the exhaustion seeping into your very marrow, a weariness that goes beyond the physical, a soul-deep fatigue. Yet even in this desolation, a flicker of something, perhaps defiance, perhaps sheer stubbornness, remains. You look towards the city walls, a grim determination hardening your gaze. You have come this far, unknown, but you will face it, with the few who remain by your side. The road ahead, you suspect, forgiving. Every historian has that one period that captures their imagination completely. This is mine. We've journeyed through the dust and despair, the gnawing hunger and the crushing weariness that defined the great expeditions to the Holy Land. You've felt the grit under your fingernails, the sting of salt spray on your face, the ever-present chill that seeped into your bones, the slow, agonizing erosion of hope, the transformation of pious fervor into a desperate struggle for survival. Now, echoes of distant battles and the murmurs of dying men begin to fade. We must confront the stark, unvarnished truth of what it all truly amounted to. The legacy of these arduous travels is not one of triumphant glory, but of profound, a testament to the brutal realities that lay buried beneath the gilded pronouncements of faith. As the seasons change, landscape of our understanding, you stand now not on the sun-baked soil of the Levant, shadowed halls of a scriptorium, the air thick with the scent of aging parchment and beeswax. Your hands, phantom sword grips, and imagined shield work trace the faded ink of chronicles penned by those who endured. You see the meticulous, almost desperate, attempts to record the events, to imbue them with meaning, to justify the immeasurable suffering. Quiet of this monastic library, the true cost of the journey begins to crystallize. The initial impetus, the fervent call to liberate sacred sites, had been a powerful, unifying force. It had drawn men from every corner of Christendom, from the bustling ports of Italy, the verdant fields of France. They arrived, a motley collection of knights in polished mail, eager-foot soldiers clad in rough-spun wool, the essential but often overlooked retinues of cooks, smiths, laundresses, and even musicians, a complex mix of faith adventure, and the promise of earthly reward. Imagine the scene upon arrival in 1191 during the Third Crusade. The air, even then, would have been a potent cocktail of unfamiliar spices, roasting meat, present underlying stench of unwashed bodies and animal waste. The sheer visual overload would have been staggering. Coloured banners snapping in the Mediterranean breeze, the glint of sunlight on countless spearheads and helmets, sprawl of encampments stretching as far as the eye could see. You would have heard the cacophony of 1,000 languages, donkeys, the sharp commands of officers, the mournful cries of those already succumbing to disease. Yet, for many, if overwhelming, spectacle was merely the prelude to a deeper, more insidious disappointment. The romanticized image of a swift, decisive victory, fueled by divine intervention, crumbled against the harsh realities of sieges that dragged on for months, skirmishes that yielded little but bloodshed, and of a climate that offered little respite from the relentless sun. Consider the words of one chronicler, a Brother Thomas, who accompanied the initial wave of the First Crusade. His account, dusty archive in the Bibliothèque École Nationale de France, speaks not of glorious battles, but of the gnawing emptiness in your stomach, the perpetual thirst that no amount of water could quench. A sky of fire, he wrote, his script shaky, and slept upon ground that clung to us like a shroud. Our brothers fell, the Saracen's blade, but to the fever that burned from within, flux that drained them of life. He describes the desperate foraging for sustenance, the meager rations of hardtack that crumbled to dust in your mouth, the occasional precious discovery of a wild fig or a handful of olives, of a moment of relief in an ocean of want. The physical toll was immense. You would have seen men, once proud warriors, skeletal figures, their eyes hollowed by exhaustion and despair, their armor a burden they could no longer bear, itself a brutal, extended march across varied and unforgiving terrain had been the primary adversary. Treacherous mountain passes of Anatolia, where the cold bit deep and food was scarce, arid plains where dehydration became a constant threat. Each mile was a testament to human endurance pushed to its absolute limit. Seasons change, we turn our gaze to the aftermath, the true legacy of this monumental undertaking. The territorial gains, so fiercely contested and dearly bought, proved to be ephemeral. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, established with such fanfare, fragile entity, constantly under threat from resurgent Muslim powers. The strategic importance of the captured cities often paled in comparison to the cost of their acquisition. For the common man, peasant who left his fields, the artisan who abandoned his workshop, the return journey was often as perilous as the outward one. For many, there was no return at all. Those who did make it back, if they survived the voyage and the subsequent political upheavals, irrevocably altered. Their homes might have been lost, their families dispersed. The faith that had sustained them through the ordeal was often fractured, replaced by a profound disillusionment. Encountered a returning crusader, his once bright tunic now faded and torn, holding a wariness that no amount of rest could erase. He might have recounted tales not of vanquishing infidels, agonizing deaths of comrades, of the gnawing fear of the unknown, of the simple, a warm hearth and a full belly. Consider the economic impact. While some merchants and adventurers found opportunities for profit and advancement, majority of participants bore the financial burden. Equipping and sustaining an army on such a distant campaign was astronomical. To increase taxation and economic hardship for those left behind. The spoils of war, the coveted plunder, rarely trickled down to the common soldier. Instead, it often enriched the coffers of kings, wealthy lords, and the church, baiting social inequalities. You might have witnessed the poignant scene of a soldier, his meager pay spent on a single keepsake for his family, a small carved wooden bird or a smooth, polished stone. A tangible reminder of a journey that had promised so much and delivered so little. The psychological toll was perhaps the most enduring. To violence, death, and suffering left deep scars. Many returned with what we might today call post-traumatic stress, reintegrate into a society that could not fully comprehend the horrors they had witnessed. Their memories were a constant. The screams of the dying, the stench of decay, the gnawing hunger, all replaying in their minds. The ultimate outcome, a devastating imbalance between effort and reward. The arduous travel, the immense sacrifices, lost all for objectives that proved fleeting or ultimately unattainable. The grand vision of a unified Christendom, March of the Faithful, dissolved into a complex tapestry of political intrigue, military miscalculations, human suffering. The legacy of these journeys is not found in triumphant pronouncements or triumphant monuments. Quiet despair of those who returned, in the empty fields and broken families, the stark realization that the pursuit of an ideal, when divorced from practical reality, can lead to unimaginable devastation. Reflecting on the sheer human cost, the millions of hours of labor, the countless lives extinguished for a cause that ultimately left more questions than answers. The romantic notion of the crusader, the valiant warrior of faith, the harsh reality of the journey's true legacy, a testament to human endurance. Yes, stark warning about the devastating consequences of unfulfilled promises and the brutal price of ambition. Dawn begins to paint the eastern sky. You feel the weight of these historical truths settling upon you. Understanding of why such journeys truly sucked. The stories of victory are often overshadowed by the silent chronicles of suffering. You simply tried to survive, and as you prepare to rest, you can't help but wonder about the next chapter, the subtle shifts in the political landscape that would inevitably lead to further, equally arduous expeditions, its own unique brand of heartbreak and disillusionment. Never quite capture the texture of daily life in this remarkable era, do they? You wake up, the gentle chime of an alarm, but to the raw, guttural cry of a child suffering from dysentery. The air thick with the cloying scent of unwashed bodies and the ever-present, acrid tang of fear. Your breath hitches in your throat, a familiar, unwelcome sensation. The ground beneath you is not a soft mattress, but a damp, uneven patch of earth from the night. Your rough-spun tunic clings uncomfortably to your skin, a testament to the relentless friction of travel and the lack of any real cleanliness. You can feel the grit of the road embedded in every fiber. The sky above, when you dare to look, is a bruised grey, in the way of comfort or warmth. The distant clang of metal, a blacksmith's hammer against an anvil, is a constant reminder of the martial purpose of this vast, shambling assembly. Glorious march of righteous warriors you might have imagined from illuminated manuscripts. This is the raw reality of a pilgrimage that had morphed into a brutal, exhausting exodus. Whispers of prayer that drift on the morning air carry a desperate edge, a plea born not of faith alone, but of sheer weariness. You pull your thin cloak tighter, the coarse wool scratching against your neck. Try to recall the vision of Jerusalem, a beacon of hope that now feels impossibly distant, shimmering on the horizon of an unforgiving landscape. The sheer scale of it all, the endless sea of humanity, each face etched with hardship, is overwhelming. The months teach you, Hugh, that the greatest enemy was not the Saracen, but the journey itself. Subtle art of rationing, not just food, but water, hope, and even conversation. Of lukewarm water from a skin that tastes faintly of leather is a treasure, each crumb of hardtack a luxury. The sun is a relentless tormentor, baking the earth until it cracks and bleeds dust, a fine that coats everything: your lungs, your eyes, your very soul. You see men, once robust and full of vigor, reduced to skeletal figures, their eyes hollowed, their movements slow and deliberate, each step a monumental effort. Women, jaunt and streaked with dirt, carry children who are too weak to walk, their small bodies limp in their arms. Sickness hangs heavy, a miasma of fever, infection, and sheer exhaustion. You witness a man, a seasoned warrior you'd seen brandishing his sword with confidence just weeks before, collapse by the roadside with uncontrollable tremors, his skin clammy and pale. His comrades, their own strength ebbing, a hurried prayer and a shared glance of grim understanding. There is no time for extended mourning, grief. The momentum of the pilgrimage, however faltering, must be maintained. Discovered in the archives of the Abbey of Cluny, a series of personal letters penned by a simple friar named Brother Thomas, his own arduous trek eastward in 1096. He writes not of chivalric deeds, but of the gnawing hunger, the perpetual thirst, the constant gnawing fear of the unknown. The road, he lamented in one passage, was a hungry beast that devours us whole, only the husks of men. He describes the agonizing sight of decomposing bodies left by the wayside, grim testament to the toll the march was taking. The sheer logistical nightmare of feeding and watering tens of thousands of people through hostile or barren territories is a concept that modern armies, with their sophisticated supply chains, can scarcely comprehend. Trying to feed an army the size of a modern city with only pack animals and the goodwill of whatever small settlements you might stumble upon. The reality was a constant struggle against starvation and disease. A battle fought with every step. You find yourself in conversation with a woman named Agnes, caroused and raw from mending worn clothing and tending to the sick. Her husband, a farmer from Normandy, had promised her a land of milk and honey. Now, her face is a mask of weary resignation. Told me of fertile fields and warm sun. She says, her voice raspy, the words catching in her throat, speak of this endless walking, of the flies that feast on our eyes, of the thirst that burns like a fever. She gestures vaguely towards a cluster of tents where a makeshift infirmary has been established. Around it is heavy with the scent of herbs and something far more disturbing, something akin to rotting flesh. She whispers, her gaze fixed on a small, still form wrapped in a coarse blanket. She never stood a chance. The fever took her before we even reached Antioch. Your own stomach churns at the memory of the small children you've seen, their bodies too frail to endure the relentless demands of the journey. Later, you encounter a grizzled veteran, a man named Robert who fought in the First Crusade. He sits hunched by a meager fire, his eyes distant, of scars and hardship. Jerusalem, he mutters, his voice a low growl. We saw it, a glimmer on the horizon. By the saints, the cost. We left more souls behind us than we brought forward. They say it was God's will, perhaps, driven mad by hunger, willing to eat their own boots. I saw brothers turn on brothers for a scrap of bread. He spits into the fire, a small, futile gesture of defiance. This holy war, he continues, his voice barely audible. More men than it ever saved. The historical records often focus on the battles, the sieges, the triumphant capture of cities, well on the quiet, agonizing deaths that occurred along the dusty, perilous roads. Forgotten individuals whose lives were extinguished by the sheer brutal indifference of the journey. The sheer number of deaths from disease and starvation during the Crusades far surpassed casualties from actual combat, suggests that for every crusader who died in battle, 10 perished from sickness or starvation. This isn't just a statistic. Chilling indictment of the human cost of these ambitious, often ill-conceived endeavors. Teach you that endurance is not a virtue, but a necessity, a grim, yielding force that propels you forward even when your spirit has long since broken. You see the flicker of hope in the eyes of those who cling to their faith that some divine intervention will ease their suffering. But you also see the quiet despair, realization that this grand pilgrimage is, for many, a slow, agonizing march towards oblivion. The sheer physical toll, exposure to the elements, the lack of sanitation, and the inadequate nutrition created a perfect breeding ground for disease. Dysentery and various fevers were rampant. The ranks of the Crusaders, long before they ever reached their intended destination. Proper medical care meant that even minor injuries could become fatal. You can almost feel the gnawing in your gut, persistent ache in your bones, the ever-present weariness that settles deep within your marrow. Heroic saga of faith and glory. It's a stark, unvarnished testament to the brutal realities of human endeavor when confronted with the unforgiving vastness of distance and the fragility of the human body. As you continue to trace these paths, remember that the true horror lies not just in the violence of battle, but in the silent, unrecorded suffering that marked every mile of these epic, often tragic journeys. Your breathing slows as we prepare to explore what life truly meant in another time. Imagine, if you will, the sheer audacity of the endeavor. Arms echoing from pulpits across Christendom wasn't just a spiritual summons. It was a promise of land of glory. But the reality of that journey, undertaken by hundreds of thousands between the late 11th and 13th centuries, was a brutal, unvarnished testament to the fragility of human existence when confronted with the raw, unforgiving forces of nature and human frailty. We've touched upon the initial fervor, the grand pronouncements, but now, as we delve deeper into the heart of the matter, confront the sheer, grinding misery that defined the travel itself. This isn't the sanitized version, is the visceral truth of what it meant to traverse continents with little more than faith and a desperate hope to carry you forward. The world around you evolves. Picture the departure, not from a gleaming port with organized logistics, but from dusty fields, a people, animals, and ill-prepared supplies. For those undertaking the first crusade setting out in 1096, largely on foot, a vast, sprawling migration rather than a military march, you are a peasant, perhaps familiar soil of your ancestral lands, the scent of damp earth and wood smoke replaced by the acrid tang of sweat and fear. Tunic coarse wool already chafes your skin. The bread you carry, hard as stone, is meant to last, but you know certainty that it won't. The sun beats down an indifferent furnace into a fine powder that coats your throat and stings your eyes. You walk beside your family, your meager possessions strapped to a wooden cart, its wheels groaning under the strain. Beside you, a seasoned soldier, mail shirt glinting dully, mutters about the lack of proper discipline. These folk, he grumbles, spitting on the ground. This is a pilgrimage to Canterbury. This is a war, and war demands order. You nod, but your mind drifts to the well. The familiar creak of the pump, the cool, clear water. Here, water is a precious commodity, muddy streams that often carry the invisible threat of disease. The world around you evolves. The sheer scale of the undertaking is there staggering. Consider the logistical nightmares that would make any modern travel agent weep. Paved roads for vast stretches, no inns providing a warm meal and a dry bed. The roads were often tracks, generations of farmers and traders now choked with thousands of pilgrims. Imagine navigating narrow passes, sheer drop to one side, the unforgiving rock face to the other, a stampede of panicked oxen, or a collapsing wagon train threatens to send you tumbling into oblivion. The smell of unwashed bodies, festering wounds of animal dung is a constant, suffocating presence. You hear the cries of children, the weary moans of the sick, incessant braying of donkeys and the bleating of sheep, all blending into a cacophony of suffering. You see the emaciated forms of those who have fallen by the wayside, their bodies left to the elements, a grim testament to the toll this journey exacts. The world around you evolves. Let's speak of sustenance. The carefully hoarded provisions dwindled with alarming speed. Foraging became a desperate, often fruitless endeavor to identify edible plants, but often the land is stripped bare by the sheer numbers preceding you. Hunger is a constant companion in your belly that sharpens your senses and dulls your spirit. You witness acts of desperation, a handful of scavenged roots, women bartering their meager jewelry for a scrap of cheese. In archival fragments from the period, accounts of entire contingents resorting to eating their own pack animals out of sheer starvation. Irony for those who had embarked with such high ideals. The water sources, when found, were often contaminated. Dysentery, and agonizing killer became rampant. You see people doubled over, their bodies racked with pain, skin taking on a sickly pallor. The fear of illness, of the unseen enemy within, was as potent as any battlefield threat. The world around you evolves. Imagine a conversation you might overhear, a hushed exchange between two men huddled around a meager fire, casting dancing shadows on their gaunt faces. "Brother Thomas," one rasps, his voice hoarse, "truly intends this suffering for us." He gestures weakly towards the huddled, shivering masses around them, set out to reclaim his holy city. But it feels as though we are being tested to the very edge of our souls. "My wife, she hasn't eaten properly in days. Her fever is worse." "Brother Thomas, whose piety seems to be waning with every league they travel, sighs the sound barely audible above the wind. The Lord works in mysterious ways, John. Perhaps this hardship purifies us, but I confess, faith falters when I see the babes crying for milk and finding none. I saw a man yesterday, his foot festered so badly. With a rusty dagger, he died before dawn. This wasn't an isolated incident. Basic medical care meant that even minor injuries could become fatal. A simple cut exposed to the filth of the road and lead to amputation or more often death. The world around you evolves. Think of the sheer vulnerability. Without the protection of a structured military supply chain, these pilgrims were at the mercy of bandits, opportunistic warlords, elements. You hear tales of entire groups being ambushed, their meager possessions plundered, their people slaughtered. Itself was a gauntlet. In 1096, a significant portion of the People's Crusade, led by figures like Peter the Hermit, was annihilated Anatolia by the Seljuk Turks, not through grand pitched battles, but through systematic raids and starvation. The survivors, when they eventually reached the sieges of Nicaea and Antioch, were a shadow of their former selves, but drastically reduced, their spirit broken. The romanticized image of chivalrous knights clad in shining armor often obscures the reality for the vast majority, the foot soldiers, women, the children, who endured the true brunt of the journey's horror. The world around you evolves. The lessons learned, or rather, that should have been learned, echo through the centuries. We, in our age of instant communication and global travel, the sheer effort and risk involved in simply moving from one place to another, the ease with which we can cross continents, climate-controlled vehicles and readily available sustenance makes the hardships of the past almost unimaginable. Yet, even today, distance travel, particularly in less developed regions or during times of conflict, can be stark. Waterborne illnesses remain a significant threat. The vulnerability of those caught in natural disasters or fleeing conflict zones to undertake arduous journeys with little more than the clothes on their backs offers a chilling resonance. The desperation, the fear of the unknown, these are primal human experiences that transcend time. The Crusades, in their brutal reality, serve as a potent reminder of the immense privilege and safety that modern travel often affords us, built upon centuries of learning and often immense suffering. As the stars begin to prick the darkening sky, you feel a profound weariness, not just of the body, but of the soul, a shared exhaustion with those who walked this path centuries before you. Smartphone weighs more than some of the most precious possessions of this era. Imagine, if you will, finely wrought silver chalice, its surface cool and smooth against your palm, bearing the faint scent of incense from a forgotten ceremony. Now, contrast that with the sleek, cold glass and metal of your device, infinite information, yet so utterly alien to the tactile realities of the 11th century. You are drifting now, your modern life, receding, replaced by the heft of a pilgrim's worn leather pouch, its contents meager but vital: coins, a smooth sea-worn pebble for luck, and perhaps a dried sprig of rosemary, aroma, a faint comfort against the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies and festering wounds. The air you breathe is thick, wood smoke, damp earth, and the ever-present metallic tang of fear. The passage of time reveals the sheer, varnished agony of the journey. Think of the grand pronouncements from Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095. A siren song of divine favor and earthly reward. You hear the echo of his impassioned words, promising absolution for sins, a direct ticket to paradise for those who took up the cross. But what the sermons didn't convey was the gnawing hunger, deep chill of a night spent on open ground with only a thin cloak for protection, the constant, knowing dread of what lurked in the shadows. You are there, a silent observer, a group of bewildered French peasants near Antioch in 1098. The air is thick with the acrid smell of sweat and stale bread. Grizzled man, his face a roadmap of hardship, gnaws on a piece of tough, dried meat, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. Beside him, no older than 16, coughs, a rasping sound that tears at your own throat. Have you heard any word from the vanguard? She whispers, her voice thin. Jack spits a piece of gristle onto the muddy ground. Only what the wind carries, Marie. The wind carries only whispers of hardship. They say the heat in the desert is like a furnace. He's scarce as gold. He shakes his head, a gesture of profound weariness. And the Saracens, they say they are like devils, swift and merciless. You feel the tremor of fear that runs through the small group. These are not the valiant knights of legend, clad in gleaming armor. These are men and women who left behind everything they knew, their small plots of land, their families, skies driven by a potent mix of faith, desperation, and the pervasive influence of the church. The promise of Jerusalem was a beacon, but the path to it was a brutal gauntlet of disease, starvation, and brutal conflict. Passage of time reveals the crushing weight of logistics, or rather, the utter lack thereof. Imagine the sheer impossibility of feeding and supplying an army of tens of thousands, often spread across hundreds of miles territory. You are with a contingent of Norman pilgrims in 1101, struggling through the Anatolian highlands. The sun beats down mercilessly, baking the dusty earth and releasing the faint, sweetish odor of decaying animal carcasses. Rations of hardtack, so dry it scrapes your throat, are long gone. They are reduced to foraging for roots and berries against poisonous flora. A stout, red-faced monk, Brother Thomas, attempts to rally the dispirited group. Fear not, he calls out, his voice cracking. The Lord provides. Remember the manna in the wilderness. We're in a wiry man with a hacking cough, stained with mud and something darker, scoffs. The Lord provides us with thirst and hunger, Brother Thomas. Trocks with arrows. He pulls a rough woolen blanket tighter around his shoulders despite the heat. I saw a man yesterday, begging for a sip of water. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his eyes empty. He looked like a scarecrow. Crows. This was the reality. The romanticized image of armored warriors clashing on open fields is a pale imitation of the truth. The vast majority of those who embarked on these journeys were not hardened soldiers, people caught in a tide of religious fervor and political maneuvering. The disease, the sweating sickness, or dysentery, was a far more potent killer than any blade. You see the skeletal figures, their skin stretched taut over bone, slow and labored. The air around them carries the cloying, sweetish scent of death. Time reveals the profound psychological toll. You are now in a makeshift encampment outside Edessa in 1147. Second Crusade. The sheer disillusionment is palpable. The initial optimism has long since evaporated, a grim resignation. You observe a conversation between two disillusioned knights, their armor dented and tarnished. One, Sir Reginald, is sharpening his sword with a whetstone, the scraping sound a mournful cry in the twilight. 3 years, says Sir Geoffrey, his voice low and rough. 3 years we have marched and fought, and for what? Edessa is lost, escaped with his life. And Conrad's army is all but dust. He sighs, a sound like wind through dry reeds. Eleanor wrote that the crops are failing back home. The people are hungry, and I am here. Shadowed and promises, and Reginald pauses, his gaze fixed on the glint of steel. I saw a man yesterday, Geoffrey, a jongleur. He was singing songs of glory, of valiant deeds, but his eyes, they were the eyes of a man who has seen too much. Beauty of the holy sepulchre, but his hands trembled as he played. He spoke of the rewards of paradise, hunger. Reginald finally looks up, his own eyes reflecting a deep weariness. We are all just chasing ghosts, ghosts of glory, ghosts of salvation. You feel the chill of that realization. Narratives of faith and conquest often obscure the individual suffering, the personal cost, the sheer effort of maintaining morale, finding food and water, of dealing with the constant threat of ambush or disease, wore down even the most devout. Exposure to death, the smell of death, the sounds of death, it leaves an indelible mark. You can almost taste the dust between your teeth, the constant ache in your muscles, the gnawing emptiness in your stomach. The stars above are indifferent and cold, a stark contrast to the flickering, uncertain torches of the camp. As you drift further into slumber, hear the distant, mournful cry of a jackal, a sound that seems to echo the unspoken lament of those brave, foolish travelers. Your breathing slows, becoming more even, more regular. The weight of the past, the horrors of the journey begin to recede, pulling away from the shore. You are safe now, nestled in the quiet of your own space. The harsh realities of the Crusades, the hunger, the fear, are fading into the background. But perhaps, just perhaps, a sliver of understanding remains, an appreciation for the sheer resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable hardship. As you surrender to the embrace of sleep, remember that even in the darkest of times, the desire for something more, something sacred, drive to undertake journeys that defy comprehension.